Beneath forgotten ages, traces of something extraordinary remain, not myth or legend, but stone shaped with precision that still defies explanation. Monuments aligned with striking accuracy, structures carved deep into rock, and cities that appear without clear origin or explanation. Who created them, and what knowledge made such feats possible? Some answers have been lost to time. Others were never written down at all. Tonight, we step beyond the limits of recorded history into places where certainty fades and mystery begins. A journey through ancient sites that continue to challenge everything we think we know. Step forward. The past is still speaking. We begin our journey in the American Southwest, where the desert wind carries whispers of a civilization that flourished long before European contact. A civilization whose ambitions were written not in ink, but in mud and stone. In the heart of the Sonoran Desert, where the Arizona sun beats down with an almost punishing force, there stands a structure that should not exist. Not here. Not like this. The Casa Grande, which translates simply as the Big House, rises 4 stories above the cracked earth, constructed from a material called caliche, a limestone-like substance formed from alkaline groundwater deposits, and shaped into walls so thick, so precisely arranged, that they have endured for more than 700 years, without mortar, without a single cut stone. It is one of the largest prehistoric structures ever built in North America, and yet, in the popular imagination, it remains almost entirely forgotten. You stand at the base of these walls and feel it immediately, that particular silence that only ruins carry, a silence that speaks. The Hohokam people, whose name is often translated as those who have gone, or the vanished ones, built this extraordinary structure sometime around 1350 A.D. They were canal engineers of remarkable sophistication, having carved over 1,000 kilometers of irrigation channels through the desert floor, a hydraulic network that transformed an impossibly arid landscape into productive agricultural land. The Casa Grande was, it seems, the crown jewel of their civilization. But what was it for? Theories have accumulated over the decades, like sediment over buried walls. Early researchers believed it to be a watchtower or fortress, its elevated position granting views across the flat desert plain. Others proposed it functioned as a grain storage facility, its thick walls providing insulation against the desert's extreme temperature swings. But the most compelling hypothesis, one that has gained considerable traction among archaeoastronomers, suggests that the Casa Grande was, in some meaningful sense, an astronomical observatory. Circular holes in the upper walls align with the sun at the summer solstice, with Venus at key points in its cycle, and with the moon at specific phases of its journey across the desert sky. The Hohokam, it appears, were watching the heavens with extraordinary care, and they were encoding what they saw into architecture. The structure was surrounded by a large compound, enclosed by lower walls, and within that compound archaeologists have found evidence of a bustling community. Cremation burials, pottery of elegant geometric design, traded goods from as far away as the Pacific coast and the Gulf of Mexico, copper bells from Mesoamerica, macaw feathers, turquoise. The Casa Grande was not an isolated monument. It was the beating heart of a trade network that connected the desert southwest to civilizations hundreds of miles to the south. And then, around 1450 A.D., it all stopped. The Hohokam abandoned their canals, their villages, and their great house, within what appears to have been a surprisingly short span of time. Climate records preserved in tree rings tell of prolonged droughts, and there is evidence of flooding as well, years of chaos after centuries of delicate ecological balance. But drought alone rarely explains the complete abandonment of an entire civilization. Were there social upheavals, internal conflicts, the arrival of new peoples from the north? The evidence is frustratingly incomplete. When the Spanish explorer Father Eusebio Kino arrived in 1694 and became the first European to document the ruins, the local Acamel o Odum, people told him that the structure had been built by a figure named Se-e-ha, a culture hero whose stories blended history with mythology in ways that scholars are still attempting to untangle. The O'odham maintain a spiritual connection to the site to this day, and their oral traditions may hold keys that archaeological excavation simply cannot unlock. What makes the Casa Grande particularly perplexing is the sheer engineering ambiguity of the site. The caliche walls, some of them nearly 1.5 meters thick, required the transportation and processing of enormous quantities of material. No quarries have been definitively identified nearby. The construction likely took years, perhaps decades, of coordinated communal labor that implies not just a capable workforce, but a governing authority capable of organizing and sustaining that effort across generations. The wooden roof that once covered the structure is long gone, replaced today by a modern steel canopy erected in 1932 to protect the surviving walls from further erosion. Visitors sometimes find this canopy jarring, an industrial intrusion into an ancient mystery. But it has undeniably preserved what otherwise might have crumbled entirely into the desert floor. As you walk around the perimeter of the compound in the early morning light, when the shadows are long and the air still holds the cool of the desert night, there is an almost unbearable quality to the questions the structure raises. Who commissioned this building? Who possessed the astronomical knowledge to design its alignments? And why, after generations of building and farming and trading, did the people who called this place home simply walk away, leaving their great house to the silence and the sun? The desert offers no answer. It never does. From the scorched silence of the Arizona desert, we travel north, far north, to the vast glacial plains of Alberta, Canada, where the land itself holds a different kind of ancient mystery. One written not in mud walls, but in a single, impossible stone. It sits in a field in southern Alberta, like a visitor from another world, and, in a very real sense, that is exactly what it is. The Okotoks erratic, known in the Blackfoot language as Okotok, meaning simply rock, is the largest known glacial erratic on Earth. A colossal quartzite boulder weighing approximately 16,000 tons, stretching over 40 meters in length and rising 9 meters above the surrounding prairie grass. It is not from here. It was never from here. Something carried it impossibly from a place far away and left it stranded on the flat Alberta plains like a message written in stone that no one has yet fully learned to read. To stand beside it is a genuinely disorienting experience. The rock is enormous in a way that photographs cannot capture. The kind of enormous that makes the surrounding landscape seem suddenly wrong, as though the scale of everything around you has shifted imperceptibly. The quartzite glitters faintly in the afternoon light, pale gray and ancient, its surface worn smooth in some places and jagged in others, scarred by the unimaginable pressures it has endured across deep time. The geological story, as best as science can reconstruct it, begins roughly 75,000 years ago, in the Athabasca region of Jasper, where this boulder broke free from a mountain formation. During the last Great Ice Age, as glaciers advanced southward across the North American continent, they engulfed this rock and carried it along on a journey of roughly 300 kilometers. When the ice retreated, approximately 10,000 years ago, the boulder was simply deposited here, set down on the prairie like an object casually left behind by a retreating force of inconceivable magnitude. That is the geological explanation. Precise, rational, and yet somehow profoundly insufficient when you are actually standing beside the thing. The indigenous peoples of the region, particularly the Blackfoot Confederacy, have their own understanding of this rock, one that predates geological science by thousands of years and carries its own form of deep knowledge. In Blackfoot oral tradition, the Okotoks erratic is known as Napi's Rock, after the trickster creator figure Napi, who appears in countless stories across Plains indigenous cultures. One version of the story tells that Napi gave his robe to the rock as a gift, but when the weather turned cold, he tried to take it back. The rock, insulted, began to chase him. Napi ran, and the other animals helped him. A buffalo herd was sent to stop the rock, but it crushed them all. Finally, a colony of nighthawks dove at the rock in rapid succession, and their impact, or perhaps the sound of their wings, caused the great boulder to shatter into the pieces we see today. For the Okotoks erratic is not a single, intact boulder, but a cluster of fragments that broke apart at some point, likely due to frost fracturing or the immense stresses of its glacial journey. The shattering detail in the story is, from a geological perspective, remarkably accurate, which raises an uncomfortable question. Did the Blackfoot people witness the fracturing of this rock, or does oral tradition simply preserve, across thousands of years, an intuitive understanding of physical processes that Western science has only recently formalized? Archaeologists have found evidence of ancient campsites near the erratic, suggesting that indigenous peoples gathered here for millennia, using the boulder as a landmark and a spiritual focal point. On the plains, where the horizon stretches unbroken in every direction, a rock of this scale would have been visible from enormous distances, a natural waypoint, a place of meeting, a site of ceremony. The Okotoks erratic was designated a provincial historic resource in 1977, and a protected area now surrounds it, though the forces of tourism have left their own marks. Visitors have historically climbed the boulder, a practice now discouraged, and over the decades, graffiti has appeared and been removed. Each intervention, a small chapter in the ongoing tension between access and preservation. What troubles geologists, in a way that they do not always openly state, is the sheer scale of what the ice accomplished. 16,000 tons, 300 kilometers, across mountain ranges and river valleys, through landscapes that no longer exist in the forms they had during the Pleistocene. The Laurentide ice sheet, which carried this rock, was itself a world unto itself, a moving continent of ice, up to 3 kilometers thick, reshaping everything it touched. And the Okotoks erratic is simply what remained when it withdrew. There is something philosophically vertiginous about this rock. It belongs to a world entirely different from the one we inhabit, a world of geological time, where human civilization is a blink, and the movement of ice across continents is the real story of the planet. When you place your hand against its cold quartzite surface, you are touching something that was already ancient when the first humans set foot on the North American continent, something that has waited here in this field for 10,000 years, for reasons that geology explains but somehow cannot fully account for. What, exactly, are we meant to feel in its presence? The Blackfoot knew. Do we? Still moving through the Americas, we travel south and west into the rugged highlands of northwestern Mexico, where another extraordinary civilization left behind the ruins of a city so sophisticated, so unexpected, that archaeologists still struggle to explain the full scope of what once stood here. Deep in the Chihuahuan Desert of northwestern Mexico, in the valley of the Rio Casas Grandes, the ruins of Paquimé rise from the earth in a configuration that seems to belong to a different world entirely. This is not the Mexico of pyramids and jungle temples. This is an architecture of flowing adobe corridors, multi-story residential compounds, underground passages, and ceremonial ball courts, a city of extraordinary complexity that flourished between roughly 900 and 1450 AD, and whose ultimate collapse remains one of the great unresolved puzzles of pre-Columbian North America. As you move through the preserved remains of Paquimé's interconnected rooms and plazas, there is a distinct sensation of walking through something that was once intensely alive. A living organism of mud and ambition that has been frozen in the act of its own disappearance. The site covers approximately 36 hectares of the valley floor, and at its peak, it may have housed several thousand inhabitants. Its architecture is immediately striking in its departure from the styles common to surrounding regions. The buildings of Paquimé are constructed in a distinctive T-shaped doorway style that echoes structures found among the ancestral Puebloans to the north, suggesting deep cultural connections, or possibly migration, between this desert metropolis and the cliff-dwelling peoples of the American Southwest. The walls, built from a distinctive mixture of adobe and calicite, were once multiple stories high, and their preserved remnants still rise to impressive heights in several areas of the site. But it is what Paquimé contained, rather than simply what it looked like, that truly astonishes. Archaeologists excavating the site over the course of the 20th century discovered evidence of an industrial-scale macaw breeding operation. More than 300 macaws, including both military macaws and scarlet macaws, were kept in specially designed stone pens within the city walls. Macaw feathers were among the most precious commodities in the pre-Columbian world, used in ceremonial costumes and traded across enormous distances. Paquimé was, in effect, a macaw factory, a monopoly on one of the most valuable luxury goods in North America. Alongside the macaw pens, excavators found copper bells, pottery of astonishing technical sophistication, and evidence of trade connections stretching from the Pacific coast to the Gulf of Mexico, from the American Southwest to the heart of Mesoamerica. Paquimé was a nexus, a point where trade routes converged, where goods changed hands, where cultures met and mixed. Some researchers have proposed that it functioned as a gateway community, controlling access between the Pueblo world of the north and the Mesoamerican civilizations of the south. The ceremonial ball courts at Paquimé add another layer of mystery. At least 3 ball courts have been identified at the site, constructed in a style consistent with the Mesoamerican ball game tradition, a deeply ritualized sport that carried enormous religious significance throughout pre-Columbian cultures from Honduras to Arizona. The presence of these courts at Paquimé suggests either direct cultural contact with Mesoamerican peoples or a degree of cultural diffusion so thorough that it transformed the religious practices of desert-dwelling communities hundreds of miles from Mesoamerica's heartland. Perhaps most intriguing of all are the effigy mounds that dot the landscape around Pakime. Unlike the flat plazas of the city proper, these mounds were deliberately shaped into the forms of animals: a cross, a serpent, a macaw, visible only in their entirety from above. Effigy mounds are known from other parts of North America, most famously in the Mississippi Valley, but their presence in this desert context is deeply puzzling. Who were these earthworks for? What forces were being invoked or honored by their construction? The collapse of Pakime around 1450 AD was accompanied by signs of violence that archaeologists have only partially interpreted. There is evidence of burning, of bodies left unburied, of a city that did not simply fade, but was, in some sense, broken. Whether by internal social collapse, external attack, prolonged drought, or some combination of all three, remains genuinely uncertain. The period around the mid-15th century was one of widespread disruption across the American Southwest, and Pakime was not the only great community to fall silent during these decades. The Raramuri people, also known as the Tarahumara, who inhabit the nearby Copper Canyon region to this day, do not generally claim descent from the builders of Pakime, though some oral traditions preserve memories of a great city that once stood in the valley. The O'odham peoples to the north have similar traditions, but the precise identity of Pakime's population and where they went after the city's collapse remains an open question. UNESCO designated Pakime a World Heritage Site in 1998, and the adjacent museum houses some of the extraordinary pottery recovered from excavations, vessels of geometric complexity that display a mastery of ceramic technique unmatched in the pre-Columbian North. Holding one of these vessels in your imagination, tracing its spiraling, black-on-white patterns with your eyes, you sense something of the intelligence and aesthetic sophistication of the people who made it. But who, precisely, were they? And where, in the end, did they go? From the deserts of northern Mexico, we travel south along the Pacific coast to the arid coastal valleys of Peru, where an ancient civilization built one of the most massive structures in the ancient Americas, a monument whose true purpose has puzzled scholars for over a century. On the northern coast of Peru, in the Moche Valley, there stands a pyramid of such staggering proportions that it is difficult to process as a human construction at all. The Huaca del Sol, the Temple of the Sun, was built by the Moche civilization over a period of several centuries, beginning perhaps as early as 100 AD, and at its height, it rose approximately 40 meters above the surrounding desert plain. It is constructed from an estimated 140 million adobe bricks, each one hand-formed and sun-dried, each one stamped with maker's marks that speak of an organized labor system of extraordinary complexity. It is the largest pre-Columbian structure on the western coast of South America, and it has been partially destroyed, which makes what survives all the more haunting. You approach along a dusty road flanked by scattered field workers, and as you draw closer, the Huaca del Sol resolves from a distant brown mass into something altogether more imposing, a stepped mountain of compressed earth and brick, its flanks eroded into sweeping curves by centuries of wind and the catastrophic flooding that the Spanish deliberately caused in the 17th century to wash away the pyramid's base and expose any gold that might be buried within. The Spanish were not subtle. They diverted the Moche River to flow directly against the structure's foundations, and the resulting flood carried away an estimated 2/3 of the entire pyramid. What survives is a truncated ruin, massive, still overwhelming in its scale, but fractured and incomplete in ways that make precise interpretation difficult. The original structure likely consisted of multiple platforms, rising in stages, with a flat summit where rituals were performed. The platform system suggests it was built not in a single campaign, but in many stages, each new ruler or priestly class adding to what their predecessors had created, layering the pyramid like geological strata of human devotion. The Moche civilization, which flourished along Peru's north coast from roughly 100 to 800 AD, was a society of remarkable artistic and technological sophistication. Their pottery is among the finest produced anywhere in the ancient world. Three-dimensional portrait vessels that capture individual human faces with a psychological realism that seems almost modern, and narrative vessels that tell complex stories of warfare, sacrifice, and supernatural encounter with a pictorial sophistication comparable to Greek vase painting. Their gold work, what survives of it after centuries of looting, demonstrates mastery of techniques including lost wax casting, soldering, and alloying that metallurgists have struggled to fully replicate. But for all its artistic grandeur, the Moche world was shadowed by violence. Excavations at Huaca de la Luna, the smaller pyramid that stands roughly 500 meters from the Huaca del Sol, separated by what was once a thriving urban center, have revealed elaborate sacrificial platforms where prisoners, likely captives taken in ritual warfare, were killed in ceremonies apparently connected to the worship of a fanged deity known as Apahek. The evidence is unambiguous and deeply disturbing. Lines of bound men, their bodies showing signs of multiple forms of violence, arranged on hilltop plazas as offerings to forces that the Moche believed sustained their world. The relationship between the two Huacas is itself a source of ongoing scholarly debate. Were they dedicated to different deities, the sun and the moon, as the Spanish names suggest? Were they used by different social classes or for different categories of ritual activity? Excavations at Huaca de la Luna have been far more productive than those at the eroded Huaca del Sol, revealing painted murals of extraordinary color and complexity that cover the pyramid's interior walls in layer upon layer of imagery, accumulated over centuries of ritual use. The paintings depict Apahek in multiple forms, as a warrior, as a spider, as a creature combining human and supernatural attributes in ways that challenge any simple iconographic analysis. Geometric borders of repeating patterns frame narrative scenes of such visual density that researchers have spent decades decoding their apparent meaning, and the debate is far from resolved. Around 800 AD, the Moche civilization collapsed. The reasons, as with so many ancient cultures, are a tangle of competing factors. El Niño events, which bring catastrophic flooding and drought to the Peruvian coast in irregular but recurring cycles, likely played a significant role. Evidence of widespread drought and desertification has been found in pollen records and sediment cores. There may also have been internal social fragmentation, as different regional centers competed for resources and authority. After the Moche came other cultures, the Chimu, whose capital, Chan Chan, rose only a short distance to the north, and eventually the Inca, who incorporated this entire coastal world into their expanding empire. The Huaca del Sol was already ancient when the Inca arrived. It was already, in some sense, a ruin, a monument to a world that had already been forgotten by the living. Standing at its base today, watching the desert hawks circle overhead in the hard coastal light, it is impossible not to feel the weight of all that time. 140 million bricks, millions of human hours, a civilization that looked at the Pacific horizon and built its faith into the very earth beneath its feet. What did they believe they were building toward? Still in South America, we move south along the Andean spine to the high arid valleys of northwest Argentina, where the ruins of another ancient civilization cling to the edge of a mountain like a dream of permanence, high above the Santa Maria Valley in the Calchaquí region of northwestern Argentina, carved into the volcanic slopes of the Sierra del Cajon at an altitude of nearly 2,000 meters. The ruins of Quilmes sprawl across the mountainside in a configuration so vast and so deliberately arranged that it takes several minutes of simply standing and looking to begin to comprehend its full extent. This was once the largest city in pre-Columbian northwestern Argentina, home at its peak to perhaps 3,000 people, and it endured for nearly 1,000 years before the Spanish finally and violently brought it to an end. As you climb the stone-paved paths that wind through the terraced residential sectors of the site, the view opens progressively wider until the entire valley stretches below you in a long blue-green ribbon, and the scale of what the Quilmes people built becomes fully apparent. They did not merely build a village on a mountain. They engineered an entire inhabited landscape. Terraced platforms for houses, granaries, ceremonial structures, pathways, defensive walls, all integrated into the natural contours of the slope, with an architectural sensitivity that speaks of centuries of accumulated knowledge about this specific terrain. The Quilmes people belong to the broader cultural complex known as the Diaguita, a loose grouping of mountain-dwelling peoples who occupied the high valleys of what is now northwestern Argentina and northern Chile in the centuries before the Spanish conquest. They were, by any measure, a formidably organized society. Their ceramic tradition produced vessels of considerable elegance, decorated with geometric motifs that echo patterns found across the Andean world. They practiced sophisticated agriculture on irrigated terraces, cultivating maize, quinoa, and potatoes at altitudes where the growing season was short and unpredictable. But the defining characteristic of Quilmes, the feature that sets it apart from other Diaguita settlements, is its extraordinary resistance. When the Inca Empire expanded southward along the Andes in the late 15th century, most regional cultures were incorporated into the Tawantinsuyu, the Four Quarters, either through diplomacy, cultural absorption, or military conquest. The Quilmes fought. There is archaeological evidence of conflict along the approaches to the site, and oral traditions preserved in the region describe a prolonged struggle against Inca forces. Ultimately, Quilmes was incorporated into the Inca system, but reluctantly and incompletely, retaining much of its cultural character, even under imperial administration. Then came the Spanish. The Spanish arrived in the Calchaquí valleys in the 16th century, and the resistance that the Quilmes had shown to the Inca, they showed, with even greater determination, to the European colonizers. For over 130 years, from the 1530s to the 1660s, the peoples of this mountain city defied Spanish attempts to subjugate and relocate them. The Calchaquí Wars, a series of uprisings and military campaigns that consumed enormous colonial resources, were in part fought over this mountain. The end, when it came, was devastating. In 1665, the Spanish governor forced the deportation of the surviving Quilmes people, some estimate 2,000 individuals, on a forced march of over 1,500 kilometers to the Rio de la Plata region near present-day Buenos Aires. They were settled in a village that bore the name of their homeland, Quilmes, which today is a Buenos Aires suburb, known primarily for a beer brand bearing its name, a grotesque irony that the descendants of the original Quilmes people have not been silent about. The mountain city was abandoned, its terraces slowly reclaimed by desert scrub. For centuries, it stood empty and largely unknown outside the region. In the 1970s, a controversial reconstruction effort was undertaken, partially rebuilding sections of the site's walls and pathways using materials of uncertain authenticity. Archaeologists have been critical of this reconstruction, arguing that it obscures the genuine archaeological record and presents a sanitized, possibly inaccurate picture of the original settlement. The debate about how to balance preservation, tourism, and archaeological integrity at Quilmes remains unresolved. What is not in doubt is the power of the place itself. The defensive walls that encircle the upper sectors of the site are formidable, thick, carefully constructed, designed to resist precisely the kind of military assault that eventually destroyed the civilization they protected. The granaries, designed to store food for months of potential siege, speak of a community that knew war was always possible and prepared for it with grim practicality. Walking among these walls as the afternoon wind picks up and the valley below disappears into shadow, you feel the particular melancholy of a place that fought hard to survive and ultimately did not. The Quilmes people resisted the Inca, survived the Inca, resisted the Spanish, and were ultimately broken not in battle, but by the quiet violence of forced displacement, stripped of their mountain, their city, their accumulated centuries of place-specific knowledge. The mountain remains, the city does not. But the 2,000 meters of altitude, the sweeping views, the cold wind cutting across the terraces, these things are unchanged. And somewhere in the distant lowland suburb that bears their name, the descendants of Quilmes carry a memory of this mountain that no colonization has fully erased. What does it mean to survive? And what is lost when the place that made you is taken away? Leaving the Americas behind, we cross the Atlantic to the heart of Central Europe, where the ruins of a medieval castle perch above the Bavarian forest, a fortress so steeped in legend and so obscured by time that the line between history and mythology has almost entirely dissolved. In the densely forested hills of the Rhenish-Palatinate region of southern Germany, where ancient woodland carpets the sandstone ridges in a thick, almost impenetrable canopy, the ruins of Greifenstein Castle rise from a rocky outcrop, with the kind of silent authority that centuries of abandonment seem only to deepen. This is a place where history has folded in on itself, where the medieval and the mythological are so thoroughly intertwined that to speak of one is inevitably to speak of the other, and where the questions that architecture raises are answered not by archaeologists, but by the forest itself, which has been slowly dismantling the castle's walls for hundreds of years, with a patience that no human ambition can rival. As you climb the narrow path through the trees toward the castle's remaining walls, the forest closes around you in a way that feels less like an approach to a ruin and more like a descent into a story, one that begins long before the stones were laid. The earliest fortifications at this site date to the 12th century, when the area was part of the complex feudal landscape of the Holy Roman Empire. The Rhenish Palatinate was, in the medieval period, a region of extraordinary political importance. The Count Palatine of the Rhine was one of the 7 prince-electors responsible for choosing the Holy Roman Emperor, and the castles that dot the region's ridgelines and river valleys were not merely defensive structures, but expressions of political authority, economic control, and dynastic ambition. Grafenstein, specifically, is associated with a lineage of minor nobility whose history is difficult to disentangle from the broader regional politics of the period. It appears in historical records first in the 13th century, when it served as a strong point controlling the surrounding forest roads, essential in a landscape where timber, charcoal, and tolls from forest passage were significant economic resources. The castle's architecture, as best as it can be reconstructed from surviving fragments, included a central tower, a great hall, residential buildings, and the curtain walls that still partially stand, their sandstone blocks darkened by centuries of exposure to the damp Palatinate climate. What makes Grafenstein remarkable in the context of regional history is its long association with local legend and folk tradition. The Palatinate forest is ancient, archaeologically ancient, with evidence of human presence extending back to the Neolithic and beyond, and the stories that circulate around its castles and ruins are often palimpsests of much older beliefs, Christian imagery layered over pre-Christian substrates in ways that are difficult to clearly separate. Stories attach themselves to Grafenstein with particular tenacity. Tales of underground passages connecting the castle to other fortifications across the forest, a common motif in German castle legend, but one that in this case is supported by partial archaeological evidence of at least one subterranean structure beneath the inner ward. Stories of hidden treasure, of a cursed lineage, of a lady of the castle whose ghost wanders the upper ramparts on nights of heavy fog. These are not unique stories. Virtually every ruined castle in Germany has versions of them. But at Grafenstein they have a peculiar persistence, circulating in local oral tradition with a vitality that suggests they are encoding something more than pure fantasy. The abandonment of Grafenstein appears to have been gradual rather than sudden. The castle suffered damage during the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, that catastrophic conflict that devastated much of the German-speaking world and left enormous numbers of fortifications damaged beyond practical repair. After the war, with the feudal structures that had made such castles necessary and economically viable fundamentally disrupted, many Palatinate fortifications were simply left to decay. Grafenstein was among them. The forest moved in quickly. Sandstone, while durable, is not granite. It weathers, cracks, and crumbles over centuries, and the tree roots that have forced themselves into the joints between the castle's blocks have done significant structural damage. The walls that remain standing do so with a kind of stoic impermanence, their faces patched with lichen, their interiors open to the sky, their original spatial logic readable only to those who know what to look for. Archaeological investigations of the site have been limited, partly because the forest terrain makes systematic excavation difficult, and partly because Grafenstein exists in a kind of administrative gray zone, recognized as historically significant but never fully resourced for comprehensive study. What excavations have been conducted have recovered the predictable inventory of medieval castle life: pottery fragments, iron nails and fittings, animal bones, a small number of personal objects, including a bronze brooch and several coins of 13th and 14th century dating. But it is not the artifacts that draw visitors to Grafenstein, and it is not the artifacts that linger in the imagination afterward. It is the atmosphere, that particular combination of silence, ancient stone, and living forest that creates the sensation of being in a place that exists slightly outside of ordinary time. The trees are older than memory. The castle is younger than the trees. And the stories that people tell about the place are older, in some essential way, than both. What is it that ruins do to our sense of history? And why do we insist on filling their empty spaces with ghosts? From the forests of Central Europe, we make a long journey northwest to the outer edges of the ancient world, to the rocky Atlantic coast of Scotland's Outer Hebrides, where the Iron Age meets the ocean in a blaze of wind and salt spray. On the wind-swept western coast of the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, where the Atlantic stretches away to the west without interruption until it reaches the shores of North America, there stands a structure of extraordinary preservation and deeply uncertain purpose. Dún Carloway is a broch, a type of circular dry stone tower unique to Scotland, built without mortar, without written instructions, and without any certain explanation for why its builders chose this form above all others. It rises from a rocky promontory above a sea loch with a commanding presence, its double-walled construction still reaching a height of approximately 9 meters on its best preserved side, making it one of the finest surviving examples of Iron Age architecture anywhere in Europe. You stand at the base of Dún Carloway, and the wind hits you immediately. A salt, heavy Atlantic wind that seems to come from everywhere at once, carrying with it the smell of seaweed and rain, and something older that you cannot quite identify. The stone is dark gray, fitted with a precision that seems almost impossible given the available technology, each block chosen and placed to interlock with its neighbors in a structure that has survived 2,000 years of these winds without a drop of mortar to hold it together. Brochs are one of the most distinctive and puzzling architectural traditions in all of prehistoric Europe. There are approximately 500 known brochs in Scotland, concentrated primarily in the north and west, in the Highlands, the Islands, Orkney, Shetland, with a smaller number in the far southwest. They appear to have been built over a period of roughly 500 years, from approximately 400 BC to 100 AD, and then, with equal suddenness, they simply stopped being built. The technology was not lost. Dry stone construction continued in Scotland for centuries, but the specific broch form, with its double hollow walls, its internal stairways climbing between the inner and outer skins of stone, its corbelled galleries, was never replicated after the late Iron Age. Why were brochs built? This is, genuinely, an open question. The most intuitive answer is defense. Their round form, their height, their narrow entrances, their commanding positions on promontories and hilltops all suggest structures designed to provide protection. But brochs have no windows in their lower sections, making them dark and difficult to inhabit for extended periods, and they would have been useless against a siege of any duration. They may have been places of temporary refuge during raids rather than permanent fortifications, bolt holes rather than castles. Alternative theories propose that brochs were status symbols, architectural expressions of power and wealth, analogous to the great houses of later periods, built not primarily for defense, but to impress neighbors and rivals with the resources and organizational capacity required to raise such a structure. The double wall construction, which is structurally redundant from a purely defensive standpoint, supports this interpretation. It is architecture that says, above all else, we could afford to build this. The internal space of Dun Carloway would have been surprisingly habitable. The central court, open to the sky, would have been used for cooking fires and communal activity. The galleries within the walls provided sleeping spaces and storage. Excavations at other brocks have found evidence of grain processing, weaving, animal husbandry, and metalworking. A full suite of Iron Age domestic activities conducted within these remarkable circular walls. Who built Dun Carloway? They were almost certainly ancestors of the present-day inhabitants of Lewis, Celtic-speaking Iron Age communities who had lived in these islands for generations before the Roman Empire reached its maximum northward extent in Britain. The Romans never successfully conquered the Scottish Highlands or Islands, and the brock-building peoples of the North and West remained outside the orbit of Roman influence in ways that their counterparts in southern Britain did not. Dun Carloway may have been built in part in response to the social disruptions caused by Roman expansion elsewhere, a time of increased raiding and competition for resources that made defensible structures suddenly more valuable. After the Iron Age, Dun Carloway's history becomes patchwork. It appears in medieval records as a strong point associated with local clan politics. The MacAulays of Lewis reportedly used it as a refuge at various points in the medieval period, and one account describes a rival clan burning them out by collecting heather and setting it alight in the entrance. This story may be legendary, but burn deposits found in archaeological contexts suggest some form of fire event did occur. The name Dun Carloway is itself a mixture of languages. Dun is the Gaelic word for a fort or fortified place, while Carloway derives from the Norse Karlsvagar, Karl's Bay, a reminder that the Norse colonization of the Western Isles during the Viking Age left deep linguistic traces that persist to this day in place names across Lewis. Walking around the outer face of the broch in the dimming afternoon light, running your hand along the fitted stones, you feel the particular intimacy of dry stone construction, the human scale of each individual block, the direct relationship between the builder's hands and the structure's face, unmediated by mortar or concrete or machinery. Someone chose these stones. Someone carried them here. Someone fitted them together with a care and skill that has outlasted their name, their language, and every memory of them by 2,000 years. What were they afraid of? And were they right to be afraid? Remaining in the Celtic world, but moving south to the very tip of Cornwall in southwestern England, we come now to one of the most intimate and enigmatic prehistoric monuments in the British Isles, a circle of 19 standing stones that has stood in a Cornish field for nearly 4,000 years. In a field beside the B3315 road near the village of St. Buryan in far west Cornwall, 19 granite standing stones form a near-perfect circle, approximately 24 meters in diameter. They are low stones. None of them exceeds 1.5 meters in height, and yet they have an extraordinary presence. Gray-pink granite worn smooth by millennia of Atlantic rain, spaced with a regularity that speaks of deliberate, precise intention, standing in a landscape so ancient and so layered with human meaning that even the air above them seems charged with something unnameable. The Merry Maidens is one of the best preserved stone circles in southwest England, and it carries with it one of the most enduring and revealing of folk traditions, the story, propagated by the local Christian community, that these stones are the petrified bodies of 19 young women who were punished by God for the sin of dancing on the Sabbath. 2 larger standing stones in an adjacent field, known as the Pipers, are supposedly the musicians who played for them. The legend is widespread in Britain. Versions of it attach to dozens of stone circles, always featuring young women, always punished for inappropriate merrymaking. It is worth pausing on this tradition because it tells us something important. The Christian Church, encountering ancient megalithic monuments that it could neither destroy nor explain, developed a narrative technology for neutralizing their power. The stones were sinners. Their circle was a warning. Their very existence was a lesson in divine punishment. The pre-Christian sanctity of these places was not denied. It was inverted, transformed from a site of positive ritual significance into a monument to transgression. But what were these stones actually for? The Merry Maidens were almost certainly constructed sometime in the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, between approximately 2500 and 1500 BC, a period of intense megalithic construction across the British Isles that produced stone circles from Orkney to Brittany. The precise dating of individual stone circles remains difficult, as the stones themselves cannot be carbon dated, and associated organic materials are rarely preserved. The circle's geometry is strikingly regular, which has attracted the attention of archaeoastronomers and researchers interested in prehistoric geometry. Studies have suggested alignments with sunrise and sunset at the solstices and equinoxes, though the evidence is contested. Critics note that with enough stones in a circle, it is relatively easy to find apparent alignments with significant astronomical events, and that such alignments may be coincidental rather than intentional. More intriguing is the broader landscape context of the Merry Maidens. The surrounding area of far west Cornwall is extraordinarily rich in prehistoric monuments. Fogus, underground stone-lined passages of uncertain purpose, barrows, quoits, megalithic burial chambers, and other standing stones are distributed across the peninsula in a density that suggests this was a profoundly important ritual landscape for thousands of years. The Merry Maidens did not stand alone. They were part of an interconnected web of sacred sites whose full extent and significance we are only beginning to map. The 2 Pipers' stones in the adjacent field are particularly interesting. They are considerably larger and more isolated than the maidens themselves, and their relationship to the circle, spatial, ritual, symbolic, is unclear. Were they contemporary with the circle, or added later? Do they mark the entry points of a processional route? Or are they entirely unrelated monuments that folk tradition has connected to the circle simply because they stand nearby? Excavations within and around the Merry Maidens have been limited, partly because the site is protected, and partly because earlier, less careful investigations in the 19th century may have disturbed stratigraphic contexts that would otherwise have been informative. What has been recovered includes flint flakes and fragments of early pottery, consistent with the Neolithic to Bronze Age dating, suggested by the monument's general characteristics. The site is now managed by the Cornwall Heritage Trust and is freely accessible to visitors, who come in considerable numbers throughout the year, particularly at midsummer, when dawn gatherings around the circle have become an informal tradition. Modern pagans, neo-druids, and those interested in earth spiritualities are drawn to the Merry Maidens with an intensity that the local Christian community once found troubling and now largely accepts as an economic reality. On a morning in early autumn, when the grass around the stones is still heavy with dew, and the granite is dark with overnight rain, and the fields stretch away in every direction to hedgerows hung with blackberries. The merry maidens achieve something that larger and more famous monuments rarely manage. They feel genuinely intimate. These are not colossal stones designed to overwhelm. They are human-scale monuments, placed by human hands in a field that human hands have tended for 4,000 years. What were the 19 stones placed here to do? What forces did they mark or invoke or contain? And why, among all the possible forms that prehistoric ritual construction took, did the people of Bronze Age Cornwall choose again and again the circle? From the stone circles of Cornwall, we traveled to the ancient landscape of County Meath in Ireland, where a series of Neolithic passage tombs crown a series of hilltops, with a drama that the Irish winter sky only amplifies. In the rolling hills of County Meath in Ireland, a landscape already rich with Neolithic memory, a series of great stone cairns crown 3 adjacent hilltops, with a presence so deliberate, so commanding, that even from a distance of several kilometers you understand that these were meant to be seen. The Loughcrew Cairns, sometimes called the Hills of the Witch, after the figure of the Cailleach Beara in Irish mythology, comprise a complex of over 30 passage tombs clustered across the Slieve na Calia Hills, built approximately 5,000 years ago by people whose names we do not know and whose beliefs we can only partially reconstruct from the extraordinary art they left behind. As you climb the path to the summit of Carnbane East, the largest of the 3 main cairn-bearing hills, the surrounding landscape opens around you in a panorama that takes in much of the Irish Midlands, a reminder that whoever built these monuments chose their positions with the careful eye of people who understood the relationship between height and meaning. You could be seen from here. You could see from here. The dead, it seems, were placed at the highest points, watching over the world of the living below. The passage tombs of Loughcrew follow the same basic architectural logic as other Irish megalithic monuments of the Neolithic period. A long, narrow passage of upright stones, roofed with lintels, leads to a central chamber that may have one or more subsidiary side chambers arranged in a cruciform or lobate plan. The whole is then covered by a circular cairn of loose stones, sometimes retained by a curb of large edge-set blocks. The largest cairn at Loughcrew, known as Cairn T, measures approximately 35 meters in diameter and is in sufficiently good condition to enter. But what distinguishes Loughcrew from many other Irish passage tomb complexes is the richness and complexity of its rock art. The orthostats, the upright stone slabs lining the passages and chambers, are covered in carved symbols, concentric circles, spirals, radial patterns, zigzags, lozenges, cup marks, and abstract designs of considerable variety and apparent intention. This is not random scratching. The placement of specific motifs on specific stones, and the relationship between carved surfaces and the movement of light through the passage, suggests a deliberate and sophisticated symbolic program that researchers have been attempting to decode for over a century without achieving consensus. The light at Loughcrew is the key. Like Newgrange, its more famous counterpart 40 kilometers to the southeast, Cairn T at Loughcrew is aligned with astronomical events, specifically the sunrise of the spring and autumn equinoxes. At these moments, a shaft of sunlight penetrates the full length of the passage and illuminates the carved back stone of the central chamber, which bears a particularly dense concentration of engraved motifs, including a complex circular design sometimes called the solar stone. The light moves across this carved surface over the course of about an hour, tracing the symbols with a golden precision that must have had enormous significance in a society that organized its agricultural calendar around the turning points of the year. It would be easy and seductive to interpret this simply. The tombs are solar calendars. The dead are aligned with the cosmic rhythms of the sun. The art records astronomical observations. But this interpretation, while compelling, reduces a profound and probably multivalent cultural practice to a single dimension. The people who built Lofcru did not build a calendar. They built a landscape of the dead, a world of transformed ancestors whose bones and presence continued to be active in the affairs of the living long after death. Excavations conducted at various times since the 19th century, including early and somewhat destructive investigations by Eugene Conwell in the 1860s, and more systematic modern analyses, have found human remains in the chambers. Not complete burials, but disarticulated bones, suggesting that the chambers were used repeatedly over long periods, that bodies were placed here and then moved, sorted, perhaps redistributed. The same patterns of collective, communal burial seen at other Neolithic sites across Ireland and Britain are present at Lofcru. The individuals interred here were not individuals in the modern sense. They were components of a collective ancestral identity, their bones mixed together in a statement about community continuity that transcended the death of any single person. The mythology surrounding Lofcru also rewards attention. The Cailleach Peara, the Old Woman of Bear, is one of the great figures of Irish myth, a divine hag associated with winter, with mountains, with the creation of landscape features. In local tradition, the cairns of Lofcru were created when she leapt between hilltops, dropping apron loads of stones as she went. This mythological attribution of prehistoric monuments to supernatural landscape shapers is common across the Celtic world, and it almost certainly reflects a genuine awareness, encoded in story rather than history, that these structures were made by people in the distant past whose identity and purpose had been forgotten. Walking among the cairns in the pale light of an Irish afternoon, with clouds moving fast across the hills and the sound of wind in the gorse, you feel the full weight of 5,000 years pressing down on the moment. These are among the oldest architectural structures in the world. They predate the pyramids of Giza. They were old when the Bronze Age was young, and they were built by people who, in terms of basic human experience, love, fear, grief, wonder, the desire to leave a mark in the world, were not very different from us at all. What did they believe happened after death? And why did they need to build these mountains to say it? Remaining in the Celtic Atlantic world, we travel north from Ireland to the Scottish Highlands, to the shores of the Moray Firth, where a Bronze Age cemetery of extraordinary beauty and symbolic complexity has given archaeologists more questions than answers for over a century. In a field near the village of Culloden in the Scottish Highlands, a name already weighted with the memory of a later, more recent catastrophe, 3 Bronze Age monuments stand in a rough alignment that has puzzled archaeologists since their systematic study began in the 19th century. The Balnuaran of Clava is one of the finest examples of a monument type known only from this region of northeastern Scotland, the Clava Cairn. These structures combine elements of the earlier Neolithic passage tomb tradition with distinctly local characteristics that suggest an independent development, a regional elaboration of ideas about death, the cosmos, and the relationship between the living and the dead that took a unique form in this corner of Bronze Age Scotland. As you stand within the ring of standing stones that surrounds the largest of the three cairns, the Clava monuments reveal themselves to be something more intricate than a simple burial mound. Each major cairn is encircled by a ring of standing stones, varying in height, which archaeologists have discovered are graded. The tallest stones are to the southwest, the direction of midwinter sunset, and the shortest are to the northeast. This grading is consistent across multiple Clava cairns in the region and is clearly intentional, a deliberate arrangement of mass and height that encodes a directional preference. The two outer cairns at Balnuaran are passage cairns. They have entrance passages that align, as at so many Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments across Scotland and Ireland, with the midwinter sunset. On the longest evening of the year, when darkness lasts for 17 hours and the sun hangs low and brief above the southwestern horizon, it sinks along the axis of these passages, and for a few minutes illuminates the inner chambers with a level of focused light that at other times of year they never receive. Whatever the Bronze Age communities who used Balnuaran believed about the relationship between the sun, the dead, and the cycle of the year, they expressed that belief with architectural precision. The central cairn at Balnuaran is of a different type, a ring cairn, with no passage and no chamber, its interior filled with stones and apparently never used for burial in the conventional sense. What ceremonies were performed within its circular interior, if any, leaves no clear archaeological trace. This distinction between the two types, passage cairn and ring cairn, used in close proximity at the same site, suggests a more complex ritual program than simple burial, though what that program entailed remains genuinely unclear. The standing stones surrounding the cairns deserve particular attention. They are not monolithic giants like those at Stonehenge or Avebury. They are modest in scale, roughly 1 meter to 2 meters in height, placed with careful attention to their orientation relative to one another and to the cairns. Between the standing stones, archaeologists have found evidence of hearths and of cremated human bone, suggesting that the spaces between monument elements were used for activities that combined fire, the dead, and perhaps feasting or communal gathering in ways that are consistent with what we know of Bronze Age mortuary practice more broadly. The people buried at Balnuaran of Clava lived approximately 4,000 years ago, roughly contemporary with the middle phases of Stonehenge, and 1,000 years or more after the Neolithic passage tombs of Ireland and Orkney were built. Bronze Age Scotland was a world of small farming communities, livestock herders, and traders connected by the great river systems and sea routes that linked the Atlantic facade of Europe. They worked copper and tin, wore bronze ornaments, and buried their dead, or the cremated remains of their dead, in monuments that required considerable communal effort to construct. The relationship between Balnuaran and the later Battle of Culloden, which took place a short distance away in 1746, has been the subject of some reflection. The battlefield, where the Jacobite cause was decisively crushed by the Duke of Cumberland's government forces, is now marked by a visitor center and a series of memorial cairns, structures that, in their own modern way, continue an ancient tradition of marking death in landscape with stone. Whether the proximity is purely coincidental, or whether the landscape of Culloden carries some quality that has consistently made it a site where lives end and are commemorated, is not a question that archaeology can answer. What it can tell us is that the Bronze Age communities who built and used the lava cairns maintained them across multiple generations. Bone deposits found at the sites span centuries of use, suggesting that these were not single-use monuments built for one burial event but ongoing ritual focal points in the landscape, returned to repeatedly as the community's relationship with its dead continued to evolve. There is something deeply moving about this. These people cared enough about their dead and about the relationship between the dead and the living and the cosmos to build in stone and to maintain what they had built across time periods that dwarf any individual human lifetime. Did the last people to use Balnuara know what the first builders had intended? And what do we lose when that chain of transmission finally breaks? From the Bronze Age landscape of Scotland, we move southwest to the west coast of Ireland, and one of the most impressive Neolithic monuments in all of Europe, a court tomb that has stood above Clew Bay for over 5,000 years. On a grassy hillside above the Atlantic coast of County Sligo in Western Ireland, with Benbulben's distinctive table-topped mountain looming to the east and Donegal Bay stretching away to the north, the megalithic monument known as Creevy Court Tomb presents itself with a grandeur that belies its relatively modest dimensions. This is one of the finest surviving examples of the court tomb tradition, a distinctly Irish form of Neolithic collective burial monument, and its state of preservation, combined with the drama of its setting, makes it one of the most affecting prehistoric sites in Ireland. You approach along a country road, and the monument appears suddenly over the brow of a field, a long trapeze-shaped cairn, its edges defined by a continuous curb of large stones, at the eastern end of which an oval forecourt opens like the entrance to a great stone theater. The proportions are generous, the arrangement deliberate. Someone once stood here and told people where to stand. Court tombs are one of the earliest monument types in Ireland, dating to the early Neolithic period, roughly 4,000 to 3,500 BC, and they are distributed primarily across the northern half of the island, with the greatest concentrations in counties Sligo, Mayo, and Donegal. They appear to have been the first large communal architectural projects undertaken by Ireland's early farming communities, representing an investment of collective labor and intention that goes well beyond purely practical burial needs. The defining feature of the court tomb is precisely what gives it its name: the open semicircular or oval forecourt at the monument's wide end, which served as a communal gathering space open to the sky. This is not a space for the dead. It is a space for the living. Analyses of court tombs across Ireland have consistently found evidence of burning in the forecourt areas. Fragments of charcoal, burnt bone, ash deposits. The forecourt was a place where fire was lit, where food may have been consumed communally, where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was ritually managed through ceremony that we can observe only in its residue. At Creevy, the gallery beyond the forecourt is divided into two main chambers, with the remains of a smaller third chamber visible at the western end of the cairn. The gallery walls still stand to an impressive height, and the capstone of the inner chamber, one of the large flat stones that originally roofed the passage, remains in place, giving visitors a genuine sense of the enclosed, lightless interior that once received the community's dead. Archaeological excavations conducted at Creevy in 1935 by the American scholar T.H. Raftery and his colleagues recovered a remarkable assemblage. the disarticulated remains of at least 5 individuals, pottery of the undecorated round-bottomed type characteristic of the early Irish Neolithic, flint arrowheads and scrapers, and a polished stone axe. The disarticulated condition of the human remains is consistent with what has been found at other Irish passage and court tombs. Bodies were not simply laid out and sealed away, but were returned to, moved, sorted, and selectively curated in ways that suggest the dead maintained an active presence in community life long after death. The Neolithic communities who built Creevy Keel were farmers and herders, people who had arrived in Ireland from continental Europe, perhaps only a few centuries before this monument was constructed, bringing with them the knowledge of grain cultivation, cattle herding, and pottery making that distinguish the Neolithic from what came before. They also brought, it seems, a fully formed ideology of monumental death. The court tomb tradition shows remarkable consistency across Northern Ireland and southwestern Scotland, suggesting a shared cultural inheritance carried by communities who maintained contact across the Irish Sea. The landscape around Creevy Keel is thick with other monuments. The megalithic density of County Sligo is extraordinary. Carrowmore, to the south, is the largest megalithic cemetery in Ireland. Knocknarea, visible from Creevy Keel on a clear day, is crowned by the great unexcavated cairn known as Medb's Cairn. The people who built Creevy Keel were not isolated monument builders working in cultural vacuum. They were part of a connected world of Neolithic communities that spread their dead across the high points of the Irish landscape, in a pattern whose full significance we are still mapping. What did these communities believe about death? The evidence suggests something quite different from what most modern Western frameworks can easily accommodate: a belief that the dead did not leave, that they continued to be present and active in the community's affairs, that their bones and their spirits required ongoing attention and management. The court tomb was not a cemetery in the modern sense. It was a machine for maintaining relationship with the ancestral dead, a place you came back to again and again, across generations. Walking out of the gallery and back into the forecourt at Creevy Keel, with the Atlantic wind coming off the bay and the mountain watching from the east, the monument's essential character becomes suddenly clear. This was not built to contain the dead. It was built to bring the living together in their presence. What do we do in our own world with the space between the living and the dead? And are our answers any more adequate than theirs? From the Atlantic coast of Ireland, we cross the waters to France, specifically to the Gulf of Morbihan in southern Brittany, where one of the most extraordinary decorated megalithic monuments in all of Europe waits on a small island, its walls covered in symbols that no one has fully deciphered. In the Gulf of Morbihan, a broad, shallow lagoon on the southern coast of Brittany, in western France, there's a small island that most visitors to the region overlook entirely. Gavrinis is a low, wooded island, unremarkable in its landscape features, accessible only by a short boat crossing from the mainland. But within it, beneath a grass-covered cairn approximately 50 meters in diameter, there is a Neolithic passage tomb whose interior decoration is so dense, so elaborate, so technically and symbolically extraordinary that it has been called, with some justification, the Sistine Chapel of prehistoric art. The boat ride to Gavrinis takes only a few minutes, but the crossing feels like a transit between worlds. The Gulf of Morbihan, whose name in Breton means Little Sea, is a landscape deeply saturated with prehistory. Its islands and shores are scattered with megalithic monuments, standing stones, and burial cairns that place it among the most archaeologically rich regions of Neolithic Europe. When you step onto the island and begin the climb to the cairn entrance, you are entering a place that has been continuously significant to human communities for more than 6,000 years. The passage tomb at Gavrinis was built approximately around 3,500 BC, during the Middle Neolithic period in Brittany. Its passage extends approximately 14 meters into the cairn, leading to a small rectangular chamber. The passage is wide enough for an adult to move through comfortably, and its walls are formed by upright orthostats, 29 of them in total, almost every surface of which is covered in carved decoration. This is not scattered graffiti. It is an overwhelming, comprehensive, intentional envelopment of the visitor in symbolic imagery from the moment of entry to the chamber itself. The carvings at Gavrinis deploy a vocabulary of motifs familiar from other Atlantic Neolithic contexts: concentric arcs and circles, spirals, axe forms, serpentiform lines, lozenges and chevrons, but at a density and with a technical refinement that is without parallel in the Neolithic world. Entire orthostats are covered from edge to edge in repeated curvilinear patterns that create an almost hypnotic visual rhythm. The carving was executed using stone tools. The technique is known as picotage, a process of repeated pecking with a hard-pointed stone, and the labor required to cover these surfaces as thoroughly as they are covered was, by any calculation, enormous. What do the carvings mean? This is, regrettably, a question that cannot currently be answered with confidence. Archaeologists and art historians have proposed many interpretations: that the concentric arc patterns represent water, clouds, or celestial phenomena; that the axe motifs symbolize a specific deity or ritual object of sacred status; that the spiral and serpentiform patterns encode information about agricultural calendars or astronomical cycles. None of these interpretations is universally accepted, and the honest answer is that the symbolic system at Gavrinis belongs to a cognitive world that we cannot directly access. What we can observe is that specific motifs are positioned on specific orthostats in ways that suggest intentional placement rather than random distribution. The most elaborate stones are concentrated in the innermost section of the passage and in the chamber itself. The deepest, most enclosed, most spatially significant location within the monument. This spatial logic of increasing symbolic density as one moves inward is consistent with other decorated passage tombs in the Atlantic Neolithic tradition, most notably at Newgrange and Knowth in Ireland, and it strongly implies a ritual journey inward, a progressive increase in sacred significance, correlated with proximity to the ancestral dead interred in the chamber. One of the most astonishing discoveries related to Gavrinis came not from excavation of the monument itself, but from study of its capstone, the large flat stone that forms the ceiling of the chamber. In 1984, researchers noticed that this capstone bore carved motifs on its underside, and that these motifs matched precisely the carved surfaces of another megalithic stone several kilometers away on the mainland, a stone that forms part of the passage of the Grand Menhir Brisé, or Great Broken Standing Stone, at Lokmariaker. The capstone at Gavrinis is, in other words, a fragment of a much larger monument that was dismantled and reused. The Grand Menhir Brisé, at approximately 20 meters in height, the largest known standing stone in Europe, was erected and then deliberately broken, possibly by the passage tomb builders themselves, and its fragments distributed among multiple monuments in the Gulf of Morbihan. This discovery transformed understanding of Neolithic monument building in Brittany. The builders of Gavrenes and the related monuments were not simply constructing new structures, they were actively dismantling, recycling, and recontextualizing existing sacred architecture in a practice that implies a complex theology of material and memory, a belief that the power or significance of earlier monuments could be transferred to new constructions through the physical incorporation of their fabric. The chamber at Gavrenes is small. You lower your head to enter, and then the carvings are on every side, closer than comfortable, and there is no light except what you bring with you. The original Neolithic users brought fire, torches of animal fat or resin that would have illuminated the carvings in a dancing, orange-warm light that transformed the static symbols into something alive and shifting. What did they see in that light? And what was the name of the one who first carved these spirals? Remaining in the Mediterranean world of ancient death and sacred space, we travel south and east to the island of Sardinia, where thousands of rock-cut tombs have been carved into the landscape, not as isolated monuments, but as doorways into an entire world of the dead. Across the limestone and trachyte hills of Sardinia, scattered across an island already dense with ancient mystery, there are thousands of small openings cut into the rock face that local people have known for as long as memory reaches. They are called domus de Janus in the Sardinian language, the houses of the fairies, or the houses of the witches, and they are among the most remarkable funerary monuments of the Mediterranean Neolithic, rock-cut collective tombs, hand-carved from the living bedrock, that speak of an extraordinary investment of effort and belief in the management of the dead. There are nearly 3,000 documented domus de Janus distributed across Sardinia, concentrated in the northern and central regions of the island, dating primarily to the Ozieri culture of the 4th to 3rd millennia BC. They vary considerably in size and complexity. The simplest consist of a single small cell, barely large enough for a crouching adult, while the most elaborate are multi-roomed complexes with several interconnected chambers, carved architectural details that imitate the interiors of actual dwellings, and surfaces covered in incised symbolic decoration. As you stand before one of the larger examples, perhaps at the necropolis of Anghelu Ruju near Alghero in the northwest, where over 38 tombs were cut into a low plateau overlooking the agricultural plain. The entrance appears as a small, roughly rectangular opening at ground level, sealed for millennia and only recently opened. You need to crouch to enter, and once inside, the world changes in a way that is difficult to articulate. The rock around you was shaped by human hands, and you can still see in some chambers the marks left by the stone tools used to cut it, a record of labor preserved in stone for 5,000 years. The name, Houses of the Fairies, is revealing. Like the attribution of many European megalithic monuments to supernatural beings, giants, witches, fairies, heroes, it encodes a genuine awareness that these structures belong to a world before living memory, while mythologizing that awareness in ways that deflect the unsettling implications of deep time. The communities that lived alongside these tombs for centuries did not know who had made them. They knew only that the making preceded their own history, and they filled that gap with story. The Ozieri culture that primarily created the Domus de Janus was a sophisticated Neolithic society with a rich material culture, fine, elaborately decorated pottery that stands among the most beautiful ceramic production of prehistoric Europe, evidence of long-distance trade in obsidian from the volcanic island of Monte Arci in the center of Sardinia, and ritual objects, particularly anthropomorphic figurines with schematic but powerful forms that suggest a complex religious life centered on fertility, death, and regeneration. Within the tombs, the dead were interred collectively. Bodies were placed in the chambers in a contracted or seated position, and over time, as space was needed, earlier remains were pushed aside to make room for new burials, the same pattern of communal, multi-generational use seen at court tombs in Ireland and passage tombs across Atlantic Europe. The bones of dozens of individuals might be mixed together in a single tomb, their individual identities dissolved into a collective ancestral presence. The symbolic decoration carved into the walls of many domus de Janus adds layers of interpretation that archaeologists are still exploring. The most frequently occurring motif is the double spiral, or double bull's horn form, known in Sardinian archaeology as the Taurine motif, which appears on tomb walls in a position that suggests it marked a threshold or doorway. Bulls were clearly significant in the religious imagination of Neolithic Sardinians, as they are in other Mediterranean cultures of the same period, and the recurrence of this motif in funerary contexts suggests a specific symbolic connection between the bull, death, and perhaps regeneration or the solar cycle. Some domus de Janus preserve traces of red ochre applied to tomb walls and to skeletal remains, a practice attested across Neolithic Europe and among anatomically modern human burials as early as 100,000 years ago. The use of ochre, a mineral pigment ranging from yellow to deep red-brown, in mortuary contexts, is one of the most enduring and widespread behaviors in human prehistory. Yet its meaning, if it had a single meaning across all the cultures and epochs in which it appears, remains entirely opaque. The island of Sardinia itself preserves something of the same quality as its domus de Janus, a denseness of time, a layering of cultures and peoples that goes back before agriculture, before pottery, before the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Nuragic people who came after the Domus de Janus builders raised their own extraordinary monuments. The Nuraga, those conical stone towers that dot the Sardinian landscape by the thousands, and they may or may not have maintained connections with the earlier funerary tradition. Walking back out of a Domus de Janus into the Sardinian afternoon, with the olive trees silver in the wind and the smell of wild herbs sharp in the air, you carry with you the weight of the dark interior, the cold of the cut rock, the absence of light that was once filled with the presence of the dead. What did it mean to be inside that darkness? And who, precisely, were the fairies? From the rock-cut tombs of Sardinia, we cross the Mediterranean to the smallest country in the European Union, the island of Malta, where a civilization that vanished more than 4,000 years ago left behind temples so sophisticated and so mysterious that they have never been adequately explained. On the island of Malta, in the southern Mediterranean, within sight of the modern waterfront districts of the capital Valletta, there exists a complex of Neolithic temples so extraordinary in their construction and so puzzling in their ultimate purpose that they represent one of the most significant and most underappreciated archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The Tarxian megalithic complex, excavated by the Maltese archaeologist Themistocles Zammit beginning in 1915, consists of 3 interconnected temples that were built between approximately 3,600 and 2,500 BC making them among the oldest freestanding stone buildings in the world. Older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids of Giza, built at a time when metal tools were still largely unknown in this part of the Mediterranean. You approach through a modern residential neighborhood, past houses and a petrol station and a bakery, and then, with almost no warning, the sight appears. A low enclosure of protective modern fencing, within which the remains of extraordinary curved walls of coralline limestone rise from the earth. The contrast with the surrounding neighborhood is jarring, but it is also, in its way, instructive. The world of the ancient Maltese temple builders and the world of the 21st century are not separated by a great distance, but by an almost absolute gulf of understanding. The Maltese temple period, as archaeologists call it, lasted from approximately 3,600 to 2,500 BC and represents one of the most remarkable cultural achievements of prehistoric Europe. The temples of Malta, Tarxien, is the largest and most complex of a group of about 30 such structures, distributed across Malta and the nearby island of Gozo, were constructed by a population that was entirely isolated on a small Mediterranean island, without any clear evidence of inspiration from the more advanced cultures of the Near East or Egypt. These people invented their own monumental architecture, their own artistic conventions, and, apparently, their own cosmology, working in stone with a sophistication that their physical circumstances, a small island, limited natural resources, a population that can never have been very large, would not obviously predict. The temples at Tarxien are constructed on the trefoil plan, typical of Maltese temple architecture. A central corridor flanked by pairs of semicircular apses or niches, the whole contained within a roughly oval outer boundary. The walls are built from two types of stone: soft Globigerina limestone for the interior architectural features and the carved decoration, and harder coralline limestone for the outer structural walls. This choice is technically sophisticated. The Globigerina is easier to carve but less weather-resistant, which is why it was reserved for interior surfaces, while the coralline provides structural durability. The carvings at Tarxien are extensive and include some of the most impressive examples of Neolithic sculptural art anywhere in the world. The lower portion of a colossal statue, all that survives of what must have been a full-length figure approximately 2.5 meters in height, stands in the South Temple. From the surviving lower half, which shows a figure in a seated posture wearing a pleated skirt, archaeologists have concluded that the complete statue depicted either a goddess, a priest, or a figure of ambiguous gender that challenges simple interpretations of Maltese religious iconography. Other carvings at Tarxien include spiral motifs of extraordinary technical refinement, carved animals, particularly bulls, sheep, pigs, and goats, and a series of relief carvings on the paving stones of the temples that have been variously interpreted as maps, astronomical records, and abstract ritual symbols. One remarkable slab carries a carved scene showing what appears to be a procession or ritual gathering, though the interpretation remains contested. The Tarxian temples also yielded evidence of animal sacrifice. The bones of cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats, found in quantities consistent with repeated ritual slaughter. Flint tools, including elaborate fire-making kits, were recovered from altar areas, along with pottery of the decorated style characteristic of the Tarxian phase. All of this evidence supports a picture of temples as centers of ongoing ritual activity. Not monuments built and abandoned, but living institutions maintained by a priestly or specialist class over generations. And then, around 2500 BC, the temple culture ended. Abruptly, comprehensively, finally. The temples were sealed, in some cases deliberately covered with earth, and the population that built them apparently vanished from the archaeological record. What arrived in their place around 2350 BC was the Bronze Age Tarxian cemetery culture, a completely different people with completely different burial practices who appear to have had no connection to the temple builders at all. What happened? Was there a sudden epidemic, as some researchers have proposed, pointing to the genetic homogeneity of the temple-building population as evidence of a community vulnerable to introduced disease? Was there a catastrophic drought, an invasion, a voluntary decision to abandon the island? The archaeological evidence is frustratingly silent on this point. The temples tell us almost everything about the culture of the people who built them, except why they stopped. Malta, walking through its ancient streets in the long light of a Mediterranean evening, has the quality of a place saturated beyond capacity with time. The Tarxian temples, sitting in their modern residential neighborhood, are a part of that saturation, a reminder that the human story on this island began long before anyone now living has a name for it. Who were the people who built these temples? And where, in the end, did they go? From the isolated Mediterranean world of prehistoric Malta, we make a great leap eastward into Anatolia, into what is today south-central Turkey, to one of the most transformative archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. A Neolithic town so ancient, so complex, and so different from everything that came before it, that it forced a complete reconsideration of human prehistory. In the flat alluvial plain of the Konya Basin in south-central Turkey, where the land is brown and vast and the horizon seems impossibly distant, a low mound rises barely a dozen meters above the surrounding fields. From a distance, it is easy to miss, easy to dismiss as nothing more than an irregularity in the landscape, a geological accident, a hill. But this mound, Çatal Hoyuk, which translates roughly as Fork Hill, is one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. The remains of one of the earliest and largest Neolithic towns ever discovered, a settlement that was continuously inhabited for approximately 1,400 years, from around 7,500 to 5,700 BC, and that challenges virtually every assumption we have made about the origins of urban life. As you stand on the surface of the eastern mound, the larger and more extensively excavated of the two mounds that together constitute the site, and look down into the excavation trenches where archaeologists are carefully exposing layer upon layer of compressed mud brick architecture. The sheer depth of the human deposit beneath your feet becomes comprehensible in a way that is almost physically overwhelming. 18 levels of occupation, 1,400 years of continuous settlement, more than 3,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramid. Çatal Hoyuk was discovered by James Mellart in 1958 and excavated by him between 1961 and 1965, before political complications forced a halt to the work. His publications caused immediate international excitement. Here was a Neolithic settlement of unprecedented size and complexity, with evidence of art, ritual, and symbolic life that seemed to contradict the prevailing assumption that complex culture could only emerge with agriculture and settled life. Çatalhöyük appeared to demonstrate that complex culture could precede the state, that art and religion and community identity could exist in the absence of hierarchy and centralized authority. Melart's interpretations, however, were not without controversy. His claims about a goddess-centered religion at Çatalhöyük, supported by the numerous female figurines found at the site, were enthusiastically received by feminist scholars and goddess movement practitioners in the 1970s and 1980s, but were subsequently questioned by more rigorous analysis. The figurines at Çatalhöyük are indeed numerous and often depict figures of uncertain gender, but the evidence for a coherent, dominant goddess religion is considerably weaker than Melart's enthusiastic interpretation suggested. The architecture of Çatalhöyük is among its most astonishing features. The houses of the settlement were constructed without streets or alleys. They were packed together so tightly that the only way to move between them was across their rooftops. Entry to each house was through an opening in the roof, accessed by a wooden ladder. This is not a simple or accidental arrangement. It is a deliberate spatial configuration that has profound implications for how the community was organized. There was no public space at Çatalhöyük in the conventional sense, no marketplace, no ceremonial plaza, no street life. The community's social interactions were conducted on rooftops and within the intimate interiors of tightly clustered houses. Within these houses, Çatalhöyük's inhabitants lived, worked, ate, made art, practiced ritual, and buried their dead, sometimes, astonishingly, beneath the floors on which they slept. The discovery of human remains interred directly beneath the sleeping platforms of the houses at Çatalhöyük was one of the most striking findings of the excavation. Heads were occasionally removed from buried bodies and placed elsewhere, sometimes decorated with plaster and paint. This mortuary practice, treating human skulls as objects to be curated and displayed, is attested at other Neolithic sites in the Near East, most notably at Ain Ghazal in Jordan and at Jericho in Palestine, suggesting that it was part of a broader cultural pattern in the early Neolithic of the region. The walls of Çatalhöyük's houses were decorated with paintings, reliefs, and installations of animal skulls and horns. Bulls' heads, formed from the actual skulls and horns of aurochs mounted on plaster bases and set into walls, are among the most dramatic of these features. Bull imagery recurs throughout the site in various forms, suggesting the same deep cultural significance that bulls held across the Neolithic Mediterranean world. Hunting scenes painted on walls show groups of men surrounding and tormenting large animals, images of extraordinary energy that capture something of the emotional charge that the hunt carried in a community whose relationship to the wild was still direct and immediate. The people of Çatalhöyük were sophisticated in other ways that continue to surprise researchers. Analysis of their teeth and bones suggests a diet rich in cereals and domesticated animals, but supplemented by wild foods. They were farmers who had not yet entirely abandoned the hunter-gatherer practices of their ancestors. Obsidian tools from distant volcanic sources appear at the site in large quantities, evidence of trade networks extending across hundreds of kilometers. Geometric textiles, inferred from loom weights found at the site, imply a textile tradition of some sophistication. Excavation at Çatalhöyük continues to the present day under the direction of Ian Hodder of Stanford University, and the research program has been explicitly multidisciplinary, bringing together archaeologists, physical anthropologists, geomorphologists, archaeobotanists, and specialists in residue analysis to build the most complete possible picture of daily life in this extraordinary settlement. And yet, for all the data accumulated over 60 years of research, Çatalhöyük remains stubbornly mysterious. What form of social organization sustained this community for 1,400 years without the emergence of obvious hierarchies, palaces, or temples? What did the bull skulls mean? What was the relationship between the living and the dead who slept beneath the floor? And why, after more than a millennium of continuous occupation, did the settlement at Çatalhöyük simply end? The mound does not answer. It only deepens the question. From the Neolithic plains of Anatolia, we travel east into the Caucasus region of what is today Georgia, where a city carved into the living rock of a volcanic cliff has been inhabited almost continuously for more than 3,000 years. In the Shayda-Kartli region of central Georgia, where the Metkvari River cuts through a broad valley flanked by dry limestone and volcanic cliffs, there is a city that was born from the rock itself. Uplistsikhe, the name means the Lord's Fortress in Georgian, is a rock-hewn urban complex carved directly into the soft volcanic tufa of a high cliff above the river, its chambers, streets, temples, and halls excavated from the living stone over a period of more than 2,000 years. It is one of the oldest urban sites in the Caucasus, dating in its earliest phases to perhaps the first millennium BC, and it remained inhabited in various capacities until the 13th century AD, a span of human occupation so long that the site contains within it multiple layers of religious and cultural transformation. As you approach Uplistsikhe from the valley floor and begin the climb up the carved stone steps that lead to the city's main gate, the scale of the excavation gradually reveals itself. This is not a cave dwelling or a modest shelter cut into a cliff face. It is a city, a full urban complex with streets, domestic buildings, granaries, wine-pressing facilities, a theater, a pagan temple, and a Christian basilica, all carved or constructed on a promontory that covers approximately 8 hectares and once housed a population that may have reached tens of thousands. The earliest phases of occupation at Uplistsikhe belong to the pre-Christian, pagan religious tradition of ancient Georgia, and the Great Hall, a large carved space in the central plateau of the city, dates to this early period. Its ceiling is carved in an imitation of wooden architectural forms, with barrel-vaulted channels cut into the rock to simulate the appearance of log roofing, a technique also seen at rock-hewn sites elsewhere in the ancient Near East, and suggesting a cultural connection between Uplistsikhe and the broader world of Eastern Mediterranean rock architecture. Adjacent to the Great Hall, and also belonging to the pagan period, is a structure that has been tentatively identified as a sun temple, a room whose orientation and architectural features have led some researchers to propose it was used for solar ritual. This interpretation is consistent with the sun worship that is attested in ancient Georgian religious texts and in the symbolism of pre-Christian Georgian material culture. But the direct evidence from the room itself is insufficient to confirm the hypothesis with certainty. The wine-pressing facilities discovered at Uplistsikhe are among the most complete and well-preserved examples of ancient winemaking technology known from the Caucasus. Georgia occupies a central place in the history of viticulture. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that the domestication of the grapevine may have occurred in this region as early as 6,000 years ago, and the Kartvelian peoples have maintained a continuous winemaking tradition of extraordinary depth. The Kvevri method, The burial of large clay vessels in the earth for fermentation and storage was practiced at Uplistsikhe and continues to be used in Georgian winemaking today. The continuity is remarkable, a tradition that connects the people living in this valley today to the inhabitants of the rock city above the river thousands of years ago. With the Christianization of Georgia in the early 4th century A.D., Uplistsikhe underwent a transformation. The pagan temples were repurposed or replaced, and a basilican church was constructed in the city's upper quarter, its stones quarried from the same volcanic tufa as everything around it, its plain conforming to the early Christian basilica tradition that was spreading westward from Palestine across the Mediterranean world. Christianity, here as elsewhere, did not simply sweep away what came before. It built upon it, literally, using the same stones and the same spaces to assert a continuity that was partly real and partly constructed. The city reached its greatest prominence in the 9th and 10th centuries A.D., during the medieval Georgian kingdom's period of consolidation and cultural flowering. It served as a trading center on the routes connecting the Caucasus to the Persian and Byzantine worlds, and its caravanserais, the walled enclosures for merchant caravans and their animals, have been identified in the excavated areas of the lower city. Silk, spices, metals, and textiles moved through Uplistsikhe on their way between east and west. The end came in 1240 A.D., when the Mongol armies of Batu Khan swept through Georgia with a devastation that depopulated large areas of the country and permanently disrupted its urban systems. Uplistsikhe was sacked, and while it was partially reoccupied in subsequent centuries, it never recovered its former vitality. The city was gradually abandoned, its chambers left open to the sky, its streets slowly filling with the debris of centuries. Modern archaeological investigation has been ongoing since the Soviet period, and Georgian and international teams have gradually mapped the city's extraordinary complexity. But Uplistsikhe remains, in many of its chambers and corridors, essentially unstudied, a city of rock that holds its secrets in the silence of cut stone and the darkness of unexcavated rooms. Standing on the city's central plateau at sunset, with the Mutkvari River glinting far below and the Caucasus Mountains visible as a distant blue wall to the north, Uplistsikhe achieves an effect that few ancient sites manage. It makes you feel simultaneously very large, standing atop millennia of human ambition, and very small, measured against the scale of the stone that contains it all. What gods were worshipped in these chambers before Christ came? And where did their worshippers go when the city was taken from them? From the high Caucasus to the plains and hills of the ancient Indian subcontinent, we travel now to the state of Bihar in northeastern India, where a wall of enormous stone blocks winds for miles across the countryside, defying easy explanation and demanding confrontation with a past whose scale most people never suspect. In the hills surrounding the ancient city of Rajgir in the state of Bihar, northeastern India, there runs a wall, or rather a series of connected walls, of such extraordinary scale that most visitors, arriving without preparation, simply do not believe what they are seeing. The Cyclopean Wall of Rajgir, as it is sometimes called, extends for approximately 40 kilometers across the surrounding landscape, winding over hills and through valleys in a configuration that suggests, at certain vantage points, nothing less than the great defensive perimeters of the ancient Near East. It is built from massive, roughly fitted blocks of stone, some of them weighing several tons, laid without mortar in a style that Western archaeologists have compared to the Cyclopean masonry of Mycenaean Greece and the Great Walls of pre-Inca Peru. And yet, in the global conversation about ancient monumental construction, Rajgir is almost entirely absent. The site belongs to the ancient city of Rajagriha, the royal house, which served as the capital of the Magadha kingdom, one of the most powerful states in ancient India, during a period roughly spanning the 6th to 4th centuries BC. Rajgir was, by any measure, one of the great cities of the ancient world. It was the seat of several of the most powerful rulers in Indian history, including Bimbisara and Ajatasattu of the Haryanka and Shishunaga dynasties, whose reigns overlap with the lifetimes of two of the most transformative figures in world religious history, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and Vardhamana Mahavira, the founder of Jainism. Both figures spent significant time at Rajgir. The Buddha delivered some of his most important discourses from the Vulture's Peak, a rocky eminence above the city that remains a Buddhist pilgrimage site to this day. The Saptaparni cave nearby was the location of the first Buddhist council, held shortly after the Buddha's death, at which his teachings were formally collected and transmitted. Rajgir is thus not merely an archaeological site, it is one of the foundational sacred landscapes of a faith that has shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people across the centuries. But the walls predate the Buddha. They belong to the ancient urban tradition of Rajagriha, and their construction is likely associated with the early Magadha state, perhaps as early as the 7th or 6th century BC. The Magadha kingdom would eventually, under the Nanda and Maurya dynasties, become the core of the first pan-Indian empire, the empire of Chandragupta Maurya and his grandson Ashoka, who extended their rule across virtually the entire subcontinent and whose edicts, carved in stone across India, represent the first major corpus of written historical documents in South Asian history. But in the time of the wall's construction, Magadha was still a regional power, consolidating its authority in the middle Gangetic plain. The walls of Rajgir snake across the Pancha Hill range, the 5 hills that enclose the old city, in a manner that suggests both defensive intent and a sophisticated understanding of terrain. They follow the ridgelines where possible, maximizing their height above any approaching force, and descend into the valleys at points where the terrain makes passage most likely. The construction technique varies somewhat along different sections. Some areas show careful coursing of the large blocks, while others appear more hurriedly built, perhaps reflecting construction at different periods or under different degrees of organizational control. What is most perplexing about the Rajgir walls is the sheer physical challenge of their construction. Moving and placing blocks of this size requires either a very large workforce, organized with considerable efficiency, or the use of mechanical assistance that leaves no clear trace in the archaeological record. Indian textual traditions, including the epics and the Puranic literature, contain accounts of ancient engineering feats accomplished by divine or semi-divine beings, accounts that have sometimes been cited in the tradition of speculative ancient history as evidence for lost technologies. Archaeologists, reasonably, prefer to attribute the wall's construction to organized human labor, analogizing from comparable ancient construction projects elsewhere. But the analogies are imperfect. The walls of Rajgir are not as famous as those of Rome or Constantinople, not as written about as the walls of Babylon, not as photographed as the walls of Mycenae. They exist in a relative scholarly obscurity, that is partly an accident of academic tradition, the emphasis of classical studies on the Mediterranean world, and partly a reflection of the challenges of archaeological fieldwork in a region that remains densely populated, and where the demands of development compete constantly with the imperatives of preservation. Walking along a surviving section of the wall in the afternoon, with the hills behind you and the city below, running your hand along the surface of a block that was placed here 2,500 years ago by people who were, at that moment, living in one of the most intellectually and spiritually dynamic cities in the world. You feel the weight of what has been overlooked. Rajgir deserves to be as well known as Athens, perhaps more so. Why, then, is it not? Remaining in the ancient Indian subcontinent, we travel further west and north, deep into the Bronze Age world of one of the greatest civilizations ever to flourish on Earth, a civilization whose agricultural surpluses fed a city of 50,000 people, and whose collapse has never been satisfactorily explained. In the flat, intensely farmed plains of Punjab in modern-day Pakistan, the ruins of Harappa sit beneath and around the modern town of the same name, in a configuration that already tells a story of loss. When British railway engineers in the 1850s were looking for inexpensive building material for the Lahore-Multan railway line, they discovered that the ancient baked bricks of Harappa were conveniently abundant and structurally sound. Many kilometers of the ancient city were dismantled and used for railway ballast before anyone understood what was being destroyed. What survives is a fraction of what once stood. Yet what survives is enough to reveal a civilization of extraordinary sophistication. Harappa was one of the great cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, which flourished across a vast territory stretching from the Himalayas to the Arabian Sea, and from what is now western India to eastern Afghanistan, between approximately 2600 and 1900 BC. At its height, the Indus Valley Civilization was the largest and most populous of the world's three great Bronze Age civilizations, larger in territorial extent than either ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, and home to a population that some estimates place at over 5 million people. The granaries at Harappa, a series of large, raised platforms adjacent to what appears to have been a working area for the processing of grain, are among the most discussed and most debated structures at the site. First identified and interpreted by the archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler, who excavated Harappa in the 1940s, the granaries were interpreted by Wheeler as massive state storage facilities analogous to the granaries of ancient Egypt, evidence of a centralized economy in which agricultural surpluses were collected, stored, and redistributed by a governing authority. Wheeler's interpretation was influential, but has been substantially revised in the decades since. More recent analysis has questioned whether the structures were granaries at all. The absence of grain residue, the presence of working platforms suggesting craft production, and the lack of the massive organizational infrastructure one would expect for state-level redistribution all complicate the granary hypothesis. Some current researchers prefer to describe the structures as great halls or assembly platforms, public buildings whose exact function remains uncertain, but whose scale suggests they served a communal or administrative purpose. This debate about the Harappan granaries is symptomatic of a broader interpretive challenge that faces scholars of the Indus Valley Civilization. Unlike Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Harappan world has not been rendered transparent by its texts. the Indus script, a system of some 400 or more signs found on thousands of small carved seals and other objects, has never been deciphered. Every attempt to read it has produced multiple competing claims, none of which has achieved scholarly consensus. Without access to written records, the internal political, religious, and economic life of the Harappan world remains almost entirely inferential. What the archaeology does reveal is a civilization of remarkable urban sophistication. Harappa and its sister city Mohenjo-Daro, some 600 kilometers to the southwest in the Sindh region, were laid out on a grid plan, the world's first known urban grid planning, with streets running at right angles, standardized brick sizes used consistently across the entire civilization, and an elaborate system of covered drains and sewers that provided a level of municipal sanitation not matched elsewhere in the ancient world until the Roman Empire, 2,000 years later. The standardization is itself one of the most puzzling features of Harappan civilization. The weights and measures used across the entire subcontinent-spanning civilization were identical, a fact that implies either a powerful central authority capable of enforcing standards over an enormous area, or a cultural consensus so thorough that uniformity was maintained voluntarily across diverse communities. Given the absence of obvious palaces, temples, or other markers of centralized political authority, features that are conspicuous in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian archaeology, the second interpretation has attracted increasing scholarly sympathy. The Harappan world was also connected to distant trade networks with a directness and sophistication that continues to astonish. Carnelian beads from Gujarat, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Rajasthan, timber from the Himalayas, and goods identifiable as Harappan, in origin found in Mesopotamian contexts, all attest to a civilization that was not self-sufficient and isolated, but deeply integrated into the trade systems of the ancient world. Harappan merchants appear to have maintained a quarter or trading colony in the Mesopotamian city of Ur. Then, around 1900 BC, the great cities declined. Within a few centuries, the urban system that had sustained millions of people across the subcontinent had fragmented, its populations dispersed into smaller rural settlements. Climate change, specifically a prolonged weakening of the monsoon that reduced agricultural productivity across the region, is now the leading explanatory factor in the academic literature. The archaeological evidence is consistent with this: gradual abandonment rather than sudden catastrophe, populations moving eastward toward the Ganges Plain, where monsoon rains were still reliable. But was it really only the monsoon? Can a civilization that produced the world's first urban planning, that standardized weights and measures across 1 million square kilometers, that built drainage systems not matched for 2 millennia, really have succumbed to nothing more than a change in rainfall patterns? The Indus script waits, inscribed on thousands of small seals, for someone to unlock it. Until that day, Harappa keeps its own counsel. From the Bronze Age plains of the Indian subcontinent, we travel to the opposite end of the ancient world, to the windswept heaths of Jutland in Denmark, where 2 of the most important stones in the history of the Viking Age have stood for over 1,000 years, marking a transformation in Scandinavian culture whose implications are still being debated. In the small Danish town of Jelling in central Jutland, in the churchyard of the local parish, 2 runestones stand together with a quiet authority that belies their enormous historical significance. The Jelling stones, a smaller one erected by King Gorm the Old in the mid-10th century AD, and a larger one erected by his son Harold Bluetooth somewhat later, are sometimes called the birth certificate of Denmark, a designation that is both accurate and somewhat limiting. They are also a document of religious transformation, a declaration of political power, and a monument whose full complexity continues to reward scholarly attention. As you stand before the larger of the two stones, the one erected by Harald Bluetooth, the king who unified Denmark and made the Danes Christian, as the runic inscription on the stone itself declares, the first thing you notice is its size. This is a substantial monument, a three-sided stone approximately 2.5 meters tall, each face bearing distinct decoration. One face carries the runic inscription. A second face carries the oldest known depiction of Christ in Scandinavia, a figure entwined in what appear to be branches or vines, an image that combines Christian iconography with the visual vocabulary of Norse art in a way that is deeply revealing of the cultural moment it represents. The third face depicts a great beast entwined with a serpent, a motif familiar from Viking Age decorative art across Scandinavia. The smaller stone, erected by Gorm, bears a simpler inscription commemorating his wife Thyra, described as Denmark's adornment, a phrase of considerable poetic dignity. Together, the two stones span a generation that witnessed one of the most significant cultural transformations in Northern European history: the conversion of the Scandinavian world to Christianity. Harald Bluetooth's claim to have made the Danes Christian requires careful interpretation. Christianity had been present in Denmark for decades before Harald's reign, introduced through trade contacts with Christian Europe and through the missionary activities of figures like Ansgar, who established churches in the trading centers of Hedeby and Ribe in the early 9th century. What Harald did was not introduce Christianity from scratch, but adopt it as a state religion, making it the official faith of the Danish kingdom, and thereby fundamentally altering the relationship between religious identity and political authority in Scandinavia. The decision was pragmatic as well as spiritual. Christian Europe was the dominant political and economic force of the period, and by declaring himself a Christian king, Harald positioned himself as an equal partner in the European political system rather than a pagan outsider. The Holy Roman Emperor Otto I had recently threatened Danish sovereignty, and Harald's conversion may have been partly a diplomatic maneuver, aligning Denmark with the European Christian community that Otto represented, and thereby reducing the justification for crusading aggression. The Jelling complex is more than the two rune stones. Surrounding the church are two enormous burial mounds, North Mound and South Mound, that are among the largest Iron Age mounds in Scandinavia. Excavation of the North Mound in the 19th century revealed a large burial chamber, but it had been emptied, the bones removed, and, it is believed, reinterred in the church below, in a deliberate act of Christianization that moved the dead from pagan mound burial to Christian churchyard interment. The South Mound has never been fully excavated. Beneath the current church, archaeologists have discovered the remains of 3 successive wooden churches, the earliest of which may date to Harald's reign. The implication is striking. Harald not only erected the great runestone celebrating the Christianization of Denmark, he built on the same spot a church in which to enact that Christianity, and he may have personally overseen the transfer of his parents' remains from pagan burial to Christian consecrated ground. The name Bluetooth, Harald's epithet, preserved in the sagas, is the origin of the modern wireless communication standard, a connection made in 1997 by a technology industry consortium that borrowed the name as a symbol of communication and connection between disparate parties. Harold's own achievement was, in this sense, precisely analogous, connecting the Old World to the New, the pagan North to the Christian South, with the monumental eloquence of these two stones. The runic inscriptions on the gelling stones are written in a form of Old Norse that specialists can read, but the translation of specific phrases continues to be debated. The word for made Christian in Harold's inscription is a single compound verb that has no exact equivalent in modern languages, and whose precise connotations, forced conversion, spiritual transformation, political declaration, carry different implications depending on how it is understood. What did Harold mean when he said he had made his people Christian? And what did his people, standing before the great carved stone in the churchyard of Gelling, understand him to mean? From the Viking Age of northern Europe, we travel to the warm waters of the eastern Mediterranean and the island of Thera, modern Santorini, where a Bronze Age town was buried by one of the most catastrophic volcanic eruptions in recorded human history and preserved, almost intact, beneath meters of volcanic ash for 3,000 years. On the southern coast of the island of Santorini in the Aegean Sea, beneath the towering cliffs of the volcanic caldera that defines Santorini's dramatic topography, there lies a Bronze Age town that was frozen in time by catastrophe. Akrotiri, as the excavated site is known, was a thriving settlement of the Aegean Bronze Age, connected by trade and culture to the great Minoan civilization of Crete and to the wider Bronze Age world of the eastern Mediterranean. Around 1620 BC, though the precise dating remains debated, the volcano on which the island stood erupted with a force that geologists estimate was among the most powerful in the past 10,000 years, burying the town under meters of volcanic pumice and ash and instantaneously preserving it in a condition not seen again until the excavation of Pompeii 15 centuries later. You descend into the modern protective canopy that covers the excavated portions of Akrotiri and enter a world that is, in a very real sense, still the Bronze Age. The streets are still there. The buildings still stand to 2 and 3 stories in places. The doorways are still in their frames. And the walls are covered in frescoes of such extraordinary technical refinement and such vivid, luminous color that, standing before them, even in reproduction, produces something close to disbelief. The Akrotiri frescoes are among the greatest treasures of prehistoric art. They cover the walls of the town's principal buildings in a profusion of imagery. Flotillas of ships crossing a painted sea, cities visible on painted shores, blue monkeys climbing painted rocks, elegant young men bringing fish to a painted altar, women gathering saffron crocuses in a painted garden. The colors, deep blue, warm ochre, brilliant white, vivid red, have survived more than 3,000 years beneath the volcanic ash, with a freshness that makes the ancient world feel suddenly, disarmingly near. The iconographic program of the frescoes provides extraordinary insight into the culture of Akrotiri, a culture that was in many ways Minoan in its artistic conventions and cosmological concerns, while also maintaining local traditions. The naval fresco in the West House is particularly famous. A long, panoramic painting wrapping around the walls of a room that depicts what appears to be a specific narrative. A fleet of ships moving between 2 towns, with figures on the decks and buildings visible on the painted shores. Whether this depicts a real event, a mythological story, or a ritual procession, is a question that has generated enormous scholarly debate without resolution. The inhabitants of Akrotiri appear to have evacuated before the eruption. Despite the extraordinary preservation of architecture, furniture, pottery, and wall paintings, excavators have found no human remains within the town, a striking absence that suggests the eruption was preceded by warning events, perhaps minor eruptions or earthquakes, that gave the population time to flee. Where they went, to Crete, to other Aegean islands, to the coast of mainland Greece, is unknown. Their household goods tell a story of a prosperous cosmopolitan community. Large storage jars, still in place in ground-floor storage rooms, contained the residues of olive oil, wine, and grain. Bronze tools and stone vessels of considerable quality were found in domestic contexts. Pottery from Crete and from mainland Greece attests to the trading connections that made Akrotiri a node in the Bronze Age Aegean exchange network. The question of whether the Thera eruption, one of the largest in Holocene history, had an impact on Bronze Age civilizations beyond the immediate Aegean has generated intense scholarly debate. Some researchers have proposed that the eruption caused climatic disruption across the eastern Mediterranean, triggering droughts that contributed to the eventual collapse of the Minoan civilization on Crete, and perhaps influencing events as far away as Egypt and the Near East. The Minoan eruption appears in Egyptian records of the New Kingdom period, though the identification is not universally agreed upon. Tree ring records and ice cores from Greenland preserve signatures of large volcanic events in the mid-2nd millennium BC that may correspond to Thera. The connection between Thera and the legend of Atlantis has inevitably attracted attention. Plato's account of the sunken civilization of Atlantis, recorded in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, dated to the 4th century BC, describes an island civilization of great sophistication that was destroyed and submerged in a single catastrophic event. The similarities to the Thera eruption and the submergence of the volcanic caldera are striking, and some researchers have proposed that a memory of this Bronze Age catastrophe, distorted through oral transmission and Plato's philosophical framing, underlies the Atlantis story. Most scholars are cautious about this connection, noting the many ways in which Plato's Atlantis differs from Bronze Age Thera. But the possibility cannot be entirely dismissed. Oral traditions have been shown in other contexts to preserve accurate memories of geological and meteorological events across thousands of years. Standing in the excavation shelter at Akrotiri, looking down a prehistoric street at a Bronze Age doorway, you feel the peculiar intimacy of a disaster site. These people left in a hurry, or they left with great care, depending on how much warning they had. Either way, they left. And what they left behind became, in its unexpected preservation, a gift to the future, a window into a world that we had no right to expect would survive at all. What were the people of Akrotiri thinking in the days before the ash came? From the volcanic catastrophe of the Aegean, we remain in the eastern Mediterranean and travel further east to the island of Cyprus, where one of the oldest permanently settled villages in the world preserves, in its circular stone houses and crowded courtyards, the earliest known evidence of permanent human settlement in the island's history. On a hillside above the Moroni River in southern Cyprus, in a landscape of dry hills and bright Mediterranean light that has not changed fundamentally in 10,000 years, the remains of one of the oldest Neolithic settlements in the world occupy a naturally defensible promontory in a configuration that is, even now, immediately legible as a place built for people to live in and to keep others out. Koirokoitia, the name derives from the Greek word for pig, suggesting a long association between this site and the animals that have been central to Mediterranean agriculture for millennia. Was inhabited from approximately 7000 BC, making it one of the earliest permanently occupied settlements in the eastern Mediterranean world, and a site of extraordinary importance for understanding the origins of settled human life. The settlement is, in its simplest physical terms, a cluster of circular stone-walled houses packed closely together on a hilltop, surrounded by a substantial boundary wall and connected by a partially preserved lane that archaeologists have called the main road, though at approximately 1.5 meters in width, it barely qualifies for the designation. The houses, built from mud brick on low stone foundations, were circular or oval in plan, with diameters ranging from roughly 3 to 9 meters. Their roofs were flat, made from the same mud brick as the walls, supported by internal wooden posts. As you walk among the reconstructed houses that a partially controversial restoration program has erected, alongside the genuine archaeological remains, the domestic scale of the settlement asserts itself. These are not impressive monuments. They are homes, small, warm, crowded, intimate spaces that were built for sleeping, eating, and the intimate management of daily life. Koirokoitia was not a city. It was a village, but it was, perhaps, the first village. The people who lived here were among the first inhabitants of Cyprus. The island had apparently been visited by hunter-gatherers in earlier periods, but Koirokoitia represents the earliest evidence of permanent, year-round occupation. People who chose to stay, to build, and to organize their lives around the rhythms of agricultural production rather than the movements of game. They cultivated emmer wheat, lentils, and pistachios. They herded pigs, sheep, and goats. They hunted the endemic Cyprus deer and the wild fallow deer. They were, in the vocabulary of our historical categories, Neolithic, stone-using, farming, settled. But the sophistication of their construction and their social organization goes considerably beyond the minimal requirements of early agriculture. The boundary wall that encircles the hilltop settlement is a substantial structure, suggesting that the community felt the need to defend itself against something. Raiders from outside, perhaps, or competing communities seeking access to the reliable water source provided by the Moroni River below. The density of the settlement, with houses packed together in a manner that maximizes use of the available space, implies a community in which social organization and the negotiation of shared space were already pressing concerns. The mortuary practices at Koirokoitia are among its most revealing features. Like the inhabitants of Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, the people of Koirokoitia buried their dead beneath the floors of their houses. The practice is attested at multiple points across the settlement's long occupation, which extended until approximately 4000 BC, and it speaks to the same ideology of ancestral presence, the dead as permanent residents of the domestic space, their bones beneath the feet of the living as a constant reminder of continuity and connection. In some burials, the heads of the deceased were covered with large stones, a practice whose meaning is unclear but which recurs in the Neolithic of the eastern Mediterranean, often enough to suggest it was neither random nor merely practical. Preventing the dead from returning, marking the location of a burial, honoring a specific person. The evidence cannot distinguish between these possibilities. The stone vessels found at Koirokoitia are among the most technically accomplished objects produced by any Neolithic culture. Carved from the local andesite, a hard volcanic stone, these bowls and dishes were worked to a thinness that seems almost impossible with the stone tools available to their makers, and their surfaces were polished to a smoothness that reflects light with a quality approaching that of metal. They have been found in burial contexts at the site, suggesting they carried significant value, either economic, ritual, or both. Koirokoitia was abandoned around 4000 BC, and for approximately 1,000 years, Cyprus appears to have been largely depopulated before new settlers arrived and initiated what archaeologists call the Chalcolithic period. What caused this abandonment, whether it was environmental, demographic, or the result of external pressures, is not known. The people who left did not return, and the people who came after them were different in their material culture and burial practices. The UNESCO designation of Koirokoitia as a World Heritage Site in 1998 has brought greater international attention to a site that previously languished in relative obscurity. Cyprus is not always the first Mediterranean island that comes to mind when people think of ancient history. The shadow of Greece, Rome, and Egypt falls long across the eastern Mediterranean, but Koirokoitia's age and state of preservation place it firmly among the world's great archaeological treasures. What does it mean that people have been living, dying, and burying their dead on this hillside for 9,000 years? And what was the name of the first person who looked at this hill and thought, "Here is where we stop"? From the eastern Mediterranean, we travel to the heartland of ancient Mexico, to the state of Oaxaca in the southern highlands, where the Zapotec civilization built one of the most mysterious and least known of all Mesoamerican sacred sites, a temple dedicated not to the sun or rain gods, but to feathers. In the archaeological zone of Monte Alban, perched on a dramatically flattened mountain above the valley of Oaxaca in southern Mexico, the Zapotec civilization built a sacred complex so commanding in its natural setting and so sophisticated in its urban planning that it has long overshadowed the individual structures within its walls. But among the dozens of platforms, tombs, and ceremonial buildings that populate Monte Alban's Great Plaza, one structure has attracted particular scholarly attention for the specificity of its name and the ambiguity of its function. The structure known in the archaeological literature as Building J, and in popular accounts sometimes called the Temple of the Wind, or in certain indigenous traditions associated with feathers and arrows, presents one of the most geometrically distinctive profiles of any ancient Mesoamerican monument, a pointed, arrow-shaped platform oriented at a distinctive angle to the prevailing orientation of the rest of the site. Before addressing this structure directly, it is worth placing Monte Alban in its full historical context. The Zapotec civilization, which flourished in the Oaxaca region from approximately 500 BC to 700 AD, was one of the earliest and most sophisticated state-level societies in Mesoamerica, predating the Aztec, and comparable in complexity to the contemporary cultures of the Gulf Coast and the Yucatan. Monte Alban itself was founded around 500 BC on a mountaintop that had been artificially leveled over an extended period, the excavated material used to fill the irregular topography and create the great flat plaza that still defines the site's character. At its height, the city may have housed a population of 25,000, making it one of the largest cities in the pre-Columbian Americas. Building J, constructed around 200 BC in the early phases of Monte Alban's development and subsequently modified, is unique not only in its orientation, angled roughly 45 degrees from the main plaza axis, but in its internal form. Unlike other Monte Alban platforms, which are solid earth and stone constructions, Building J contains an internal tunnel that passes diagonally through the structure from one side to the other. The axis of this tunnel has been studied by archaeoastronomers who have proposed that it aligns with the setting of the bright star Capella Alpha Aurigae at the time of the structure's construction, and that this alignment was significant for the Zapotec agricultural calendar. The external faces of Building J are covered in carved stone slabs bearing hieroglyphic texts and images that have been interpreted as conquest records, lists of the places subjugated by Monte Alban's rulers, accompanied by depictions of the upside-down heads of defeated rulers, a Mesoamerican artistic convention for communicating the defeat and humiliation of an enemy. If this interpretation is correct, Building J was simultaneously an astronomical instrument and a monument to military power, a structure that connected the movements of the stars to the expansion of the Zapotec state in ways that modern categories do not easily accommodate. The association with feathers in certain indigenous accounts of the structure is difficult to trace through the written record, but connects the building to one of the most profound and pervasive symbolic complexes of Mesoamerican culture. Feathers, particularly the long green tail plumes of the Quetzal bird, and the mosaic featherwork crafted from hummingbird, macaw, and other exotic species, were among the most sacred and costly materials in the pre-Columbian world. They were worn by rulers, offered to gods, and incorporated into ritual regalia of enormous symbolic power. The Aztec featherwork objects that survive in European museums are among the most technically astonishing artifacts of the pre-Columbian world, and the tradition they represent goes back thousands of years into Mesoamerican prehistory. Whether Building J specifically served as a repository or display space for feathered regalia, as some non-academic interpretations have proposed, is not supported by the excavation record. But the symbolic connection between the star alignments encoded in the building's orientation and the feathered deity traditions of Mesoamerica is not arbitrary. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was associated with the planet Venus, whose movements were tracked with extraordinary precision by Mesoamerican astronomers. A building oriented toward celestial phenomena might reasonably be understood within a Mesoamerican cosmological framework as a feathered building, a building whose orientation connected the Earth to the living sky. The full Zapotec name for Building J, if it had one, is not recorded. The Zapotec writing system, one of the earliest in the Americas, developed at Monte Alban itself, has been only partially deciphered, and the texts on the building's carved slabs remain incompletely understood. We can read the conquest records partially, inferring the names of subjugated places from contextual analysis, but the cosmological texts, if any, exist among the carvings, remain beyond our grasp. Standing on the great plaza of Monte Alban at dawn, when the morning mist fills the valley far below, and the mountains catch the first light while the plaza is still in shadow, Building J's distinctive arrow shape seems to point at something just beyond the visible horizon. What it is pointing toward, astronomically, politically, spiritually, continues to be a question that the monument itself declines to answer simply. What did the Zapotec rulers see when they stood inside that tunnel and watched the stars move through its axis? And what did the people below, watching the monument from the plaza, believe was happening in the sky above their city? From the highlands of ancient Mexico, we make one of the more controversial journeys in our entire exploration to the valley of the Visoko River in Bosnia, where a series of hills have been claimed by some to be the largest pyramids in the world, and dismissed by others as natural geological formations. The truth, as ever, is more complicated than either extreme. In the Visoko Valley of central Bosnia and Herzegovina, approximately 30 kilometers northwest of Sarajevo, a group of unusually regular-shaped hills have been at the center of one of the most heated controversies in contemporary archaeology since 2005, when a Bosnian-American businessman named Samir Osmanagic announced that these hills were the remains of a complex of ancient pyramids, larger, older, and more significant than anything in Egypt. The claim was extraordinary. The response from the professional archaeological community was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. What followed, and what continues to this day, is a confrontation between popular enthusiasm and scientific rigor that tells us almost as much about the sociology of archaeology as it does about the hills themselves. The central hill in question, known as Vysočika, is the site of the medieval fortress of Vysoki and rises to approximately 213 meters above the valley floor. It has a broadly pyramidal shape when viewed from certain angles, four roughly triangular faces converging toward a summit, and this shape, combined with the valley's unusual concentration of hill formations, prompted Osmanagic's initial hypothesis. He called it the Pyramid of the Sun, larger than Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza, and he proposed that the surrounding hills constituted a complex that included a Pyramid of the Moon, a Pyramid of the Dragon, and a Temple of Mother Earth. The professional response was swift and unambiguous. The European Association of Archaeologists issued a statement in 2006 calling the pyramid claims a cruel hoax and expressing concern that the excavations being conducted to prove the hypothesis were damaging genuine archaeological layers, specifically the medieval Bosnian cultural heritage of the Vysočika Hill, which includes the remains of the genuine medieval capital of the Bosnian state. Geologists brought in to examine the site concluded that the hill's shape was the result of natural geological processes. The Bosnian flysch, a sequence of alternating hard and soft sedimentary layers, tends to erode into pyramidal or faceted shapes, and the apparent stone blocks, visible in certain excavated sections, were interpreted as natural sandstone formations produced by fracturing along geological planes. This is, in essence, where the mainstream scientific consensus sits. Vysočika and its neighbors are natural hills, geologically structured in ways that produce superficially regular surfaces, and the pyramid claims are not supported by credible evidence. But the story does not end there, and it is worth engaging with the full complexity of the situation rather than simply dismissing it. The Visoko Valley is genuinely rich in archaeological heritage. The area around Vysočika contains evidence of occupation spanning from the Neolithic through to the medieval period, and some of the materials recovered from Osmanagic's excavations, including worked stone surfaces and what appear to be paved areas, have been difficult to explain purely as natural formations. Independent researchers who have examined these materials have reached varying conclusions, and a small but persistent minority of qualified geologists and archaeologists have expressed reservations about the completeness of the mainstream dismissal. The underground tunnels discovered in the valley, known locally as Ravne, and attributed by Osmanagic to the ancient pyramid builders, present a particular interpretive challenge. The tunnels are real. They are physical features that exist underground in the valley, and their origin is genuinely disputed. Osmanagic claims they were constructed by the pyramid builders as an underground network connecting the pyramid complex. Mainstream geologists have attributed them to natural karst erosion processes, augmented by more recent mining activities. The matter has not been definitively settled. What is undeniable is that the Bosnian Pyramid Project has become a global phenomenon, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors and generating enormous economic activity in a region still recovering from the devastating 1990s conflict. The site has its own foundation, its own research program, and its own community of international supporters who believe that the mainstream archaeological response is a combination of professional conservatism, Eurocentrism, and institutional defensiveness. For our purposes, the Bosnian pyramids present a different kind of mystery than the other sites in this exploration. Not the mystery of what ancient people built and why, but the mystery of how we decide what counts as ancient human construction in the first place. The criteria we use to distinguish human-made from natural, the institutional structures through which archaeological claims are validated or rejected, the role of popular enthusiasm in driving archaeological investigation, all of these are laid bare by the Bosnian case with an uncomfortable clarity. Standing on the summit of Visočica in the afternoon, with the valley stretching away below and the ruins of the medieval fortress at your back, you are in a place where human history is genuinely layered and genuinely complex, whatever the pyramids turn out to be. Medieval Bosnia was a remarkable and insufficiently known culture. The pre-medieval archaeology of this valley is real and valuable. Perhaps the most honest thing to say about the Bosnian pyramids is this: we do not yet know everything about this valley, and in that not knowing, something genuine remains. What are these hills, and why do we need them to be pyramids? For our final destination, we return to the far north of Europe, to the remote Orkney Islands off the northern coast of Scotland, where one of the strangest and most intimate prehistoric monuments in the world was created not by stacking stones upward, but by cutting down into the living rock. On the island of Hoy in the Orkney archipelago, in a landscape of dramatic hills and moorland that feels, even in summer, as though it belongs to a geological rather than a human timescale, there lies a monument unlike any other in the British Isles. The Dwarfy Stane, an enormous block of old red sandstone, approximately 8.5 meters long and 2 meters high, deposited by glaciation in a narrow valley, has been hollowed out from the inside to create a small chamber that was once, 5,000 years ago, a tomb. Not a stone circle, not a cairn, not a passage built from multiple pieces. A single massive block of stone entered from one end with 2 small cells cut into its interior walls, the whole closed by a stone plug that still lies, displaced, beside the entrance. There is nothing quite like the Dwarfy Stane anywhere in the prehistoric world of northwestern Europe. Rock-cut tombs are known from the Mediterranean, from Sardinia, from Malta, from the chalk downs of Normandy. But in the megalithic tradition of Britain and Ireland, monuments are almost universally additive. Stones are moved and stacked to create interior space. The Dwarfy Stane is subtractive. Space was created by removing material from an existing object. The distinction matters more than it might initially seem. because it implies a fundamentally different relationship between the monument and the material from which it is made. As you lie on the damp moorland grass and peer into the entrance passage, then crawl inside, for the interior is low and requires the living to make themselves small. The two cells open left and right, each large enough for one person to lie in, each cut with a care that suggests precision rather than improvisation. The stone above your head is approximately 1 meter thick. The walls are smooth. The silence is absolute, except for the sound of the wind moving across the entrance behind you. The dwarfy stane was carved during the Neolithic period, likely between 3000 and 2500 BC, at roughly the same time that the great passage tombs of Maes Howe, only a few kilometers away on the Orkney mainland, were being constructed. Orkney in the Neolithic was extraordinary fertile ground, culturally, architecturally, and intellectually. The concentration of megalithic monuments on these islands, including Maes Howe, the Ring of Brodgar, the standing stones of Stennis, and the settlement of Skara Brae, places Orkney among the most significant archaeological landscapes in the world, a place where the Neolithic tradition reached, for a few centuries, a particular height of complexity and ambition. The dwarfy stane fits within this landscape, but does not resemble it. Its singularity is precisely the point, or, if not the point, at least the feature that makes it most demanding of explanation. Why cut into a single boulder when the more conventional approach, stacking orthostats beneath a cairn, was apparently available and demonstrated by the monuments visible from the same hillside? Was the boulder itself considered sacred, perhaps? A glacial erratic of unusual size, dropped here by the retreating ice, and understood as a gift from whatever powers govern the movement of the earth? Was the technique imported from a Mediterranean tradition of rock-cut tomb construction, carried north by seafarers moving along the Atlantic facade of Europe? Or was it a local innovation, a singular experiment by a community that decided, for reasons we cannot recover, that this boulder was the right vessel for their dead? The folk tradition surrounding the dwarfy stane is, predictably, rich with supernatural attribution. The stone is described in Orkney legend as the work of a giant or a troll, a being of supernatural strength who could hollow stone with his hands. In the Norse tradition that followed the Neolithic in Orkney by more than 2,000 years, the word dwarfy connects to the Dvergar, the dwarves of Norse mythology, who were specifically associated with skill in stone and metalworking, who lived within mountains and could carve rock as others carved wood. The connection between the monument and the mythological craftsmen who live inside stone is not arbitrary. It reflects an intuition, preserved in story, that whoever made this thing possessed capabilities that ordinary people did not. In 1850, the great Victorian writer and traveler George Borrow visited the dwarfy stane and, charmed by its atmosphere, spent a night inside it. He carved his name in Persian on the exterior, an inscription that is still visible and that represents, in its curious way, one more layer in the monument's long history of human responses. Centuries earlier, some unknown visitor had scratched a runic inscription on the stone's surface, now weathered beyond legibility. The impulse to add one's name to a monument, to claim a connection with its mystery, is apparently irresistible across cultures and centuries. What the dwarfy stane ultimately offers, more than any other site in our long exploration, is an experience of pure human mystery, stripped of most of its usual archaeological context. No one knows who cut it. No one knows what they believed about the dead they placed within it. No one knows why they chose this particular boulder, in this particular valley, on this particular island at the northern edge of the prehistoric world. We have the monument, and we have the moorland, and we have the wind off the Atlantic, which is the same wind that blew 5,000 years ago, when the last Neolithic hand smoothed the last cut surface and the stone plug was rolled into place. And then, one day, it was rolled away. By whom and why and what they found inside. These questions have no answers. The stone gives up nothing. It only sits in its valley, enormous and ancient and utterly, magnificently silent, inviting the next generation of questions that it will never answer. This is what the past does to us if we let it. Not explain itself, not resolve, but open, endlessly, vertiginously open, into depths that no excavation has yet reached, and perhaps never will. The silence continues, and we stand in it, listening.